9,614th meeting of the Security Council is resumed. I wish to remind all speakers to limit their statements to no more than 4 minutes in order to enable the Council to carry out its work expeditiously. Flashing lights on the collars of the microphones will prompt speakers to bring their remarks to a close after 4 minutes. I now give the floor to the representative of Mexico.
Muchas gracias, señora presidenta.
Thank you very much, Madam President. Mexico thanks Malta for convening this annual open debate on sexual violence in armed conflict and is grateful to the presentation by Ms. Pramila Patten, Special Representative of the Secretary General, on this topic. Mexico recognizes progress made based on Resolution 1820 and subsequent resolutions, as well as the codification of sexual crimes in the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. But unfortunately, these violations of international humanitarian law persist and are even worsening in conflict situations, particularly those conflicts in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Ethiopia, Haiti, Ukraine, South Sudan, and the occupied Palestinian territories, as observed in the most recent report of the Secretary General. In this regard, my country, Mexico, wishes to underscore the following aspects. Firstly, women are unfortunately those most exposed and most vulnerable to situations of domestic, sexual, gender-based violence or crimes perpetrated during armed conflict. Secondly, sexual abuse continues to be used on an unprecedented scale as a weapon of war. In this regard, the perpetrators are often repeat offenders and they enjoy impunity, whilst the victims remain marginalised and often face justice systems which are not designed to address them. Thirdly, and in line with the central issue of this debate, it has been shown that the proliferation and trafficking of small arms and light weapons increases violations of human rights, including the use of sexual violence by armed groups or organised crime. Madam President, as documented by the Secretary General of the UN in his reports, and as a result of the prevailing complex geopolitical context, countries have increased their security budgets, choosing to purchase more weapons ahead of other immediate priorities. Mexico shares the concern regarding the fact that the increased use of militias and military groups and private security in conflict has increased the commission of serious crimes, including sexual violence, with subsequent immunity. For these reasons, we support and echo the call of the Secretary General in the new Agenda for Peace to reduce military spending and implement actions to limit the impact of weapons on gender equality. In this regard, we support the need to foster a cross-cutting gender approach in the international disarmament and weapons control instruments so as to adequately respond to the differentiated impact of armed violence for gender reasons. Resolution 2616 of the Security Council, promoted by my country, is a clear and tangible example in this regard. Finally, and pursuant to the above, as part of our feminist foreign policy, Mexico calls for significant participation of women in the processes of designing policies related to controlling small arms and light weapons, in line with the Women, Peace and Security agenda. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of Mexico for their statement, and I give the floor to Ms. Laetitia Courtois, Permanent Observer and Head of Delegation of the International Committee of the Red Cross to the United Nations.
Thank you, Madam President, Excellencies and colleagues. Sexual violence in conflict is not an isolated occurrence. The Women, Peace and Security agenda has long affirmed that to end this horror, the root cause of gender inequality must be tackled too. Sexual violence cannot be divorced from the thorns of gender bias and discrimination in our societies. They carry through to our battlefields. This is why a gender perspective is important throughout our instruments and decision-making processes. Inequality at all levels impacts behavior of war. It is also why the ICRC is heartened by advancement in arms treaties and declaration in recent years. More and more, instruments deal expressly with gender. The Arms Trade Treaty recognizes the connection between arms and gender-based violence. The Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons includes a commitment to assess gender impacts. The Explosive Weapons in Populated Areas Declaration encourages the tracking of civilian casualty data disaggregated by sex and age. Action plans on mine education and action address gender in victim assistance. Those advancements are key. But more gender perspective is needed at the level of military operations too, be they carried out by state or by non-state armed groups. Sexual violence and other gender harm is reduced when a culture of restraint and compliance with the law is promoted across armed forces doctrine, education, training, and disciplinary systems. It should be communicated in a way that is relatable and actionable across all ranks. A gender perspective can be embedded in this operation in service of international humanitarian law obligation regarding non-discrimination and civilian protection. State could commit to interpreting IHL with a gender perspective, integrate strong provisions addressing non-discrimination and gender in military manuals, including the prohibition of sexual violence, appointing gender advisors to positions of influence in armed forces, reinforce commanders' responsibilities to prevent and respond to sexual violence, ensure domestic laws feature non-exhaustive definition of sexual violence, free from gender stereotypes, with special measures of protection for victims, survivors, and the criminalization of sexual violence as a war crime. When partnering with others in the case of CRSV allegations, taking meaningful action to address those concerns is also important. The ICRC's new report on IHL and a gender perspective in military operation gives more examples. But finally, today's open debate focuses also on demilitarization as a step towards peace. It is no coincidence that as the rights of women and girls decline, violence rises. Where conflict persists, equality for women and girls is eroded, and gender equality is a marker of peace and security. Today, gender gaps are particularly deep in conflicts where the ICRC works. Respect for international humanitarian law is a starting point to prevent the gender gap from widening during and after conflict subsides. It is also reinforcing the pathway towards peace for all. And we ask to conclude that international security is understood to be human security, and that means security of diverse men, women, girls, and boys alike. Thank you.
I thank Ms. Courtois for her statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Costa Rica.
Madam President, as the President-designate of the 4th Review Conference of the Programme of Action to Prevent, Combat and Eradicate the Illicit Trade of Small Arms and Light Weapons in all its aspects, I would like to thank Malta for focusing this year's debate on preventing conflict-related sexual violence through gender-responsive arms control. Arms are not the only root cause of this kind of violence. As with all forms of gender-based violence, this begins before the conflict breaks out and continues well after the last armed hostility. These acts are committed on battlefields, but also in public spaces and homes, and are often facilitated by small arms and light weapons. In this regard, please allow me to stress 4 points. First, in addition to controlling the illicit supply of weapons, we need to understand and address why using arms to exert power is predominantly a male gender norm. Only by addressing these norms and behaviours through nationally owned efforts in security sector reform and community violence reduction can we ensure that when the conflict ends, violence ends for everyone. Second, post-conflict disarmament, demobilization and reintegration programs should lay down weapons and provide work for former combatants and incorporate psychological disarmament dimensions by providing pathways for ex-combatants to feel protected and respected in their societies without needing to own or carry a weapon. Third, state security institutions must raise awareness about and assess their staff. It is not operationally effective for any state to arm individuals who are fighting threats during the day and harming those who they're supposed to be protecting during the night. Fourth, we must elevate the visibility of conflict-related sexual violence. Visibility requires robust data on the identity of the perpetrators and victims of this kind of violence, and identifying whether it is facilitated by illicit weapons or service weapons provided by states, accomplished in close cooperation with and funding for civil society organisations and survivors. Madam President, tackling illicit small arms and light weapons is one of the most critical tools to bring an end to conflict-related sexual violence. I urge the women and peace and security experts to engage and collaborate closely in the review conference in June to advance gender-responsive arms control. Conflict-related sexual violence is not an inevitable consequence of conflict. We must focus our energies on sharing, promoting, implementing and funding tried and tested good practices related to gender-responsive arms control, since this is essential in order to protect the vulnerable and consequently to protect our collective security. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Costa Rica for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of South Africa.
Thank you, Madam President. We thank Malta for convening this critical annual open debate. We also appreciate the informative presentations by the briefers this morning. South Africa remains committed to its obligations as a member of the international community to protect women and girls from violence, especially sexual violence. The question of sexual violence within armed conflict is fundamentally a human rights issue that is complicated by the vulnerabilities created through conflict and exacerbated by unequal power relations between men and women. Violence against women constitutes a violation of the rights and fundamental freedoms of women and impairs their enjoyment of those rights and freedoms. This is especially the case as it relates to sexual violence that denies the dignity of all women and girls that are victims of such crimes. This requires simultaneous action to eradicate armed conflicts and to address the root causes of sexual violence in conflict. Madam President, South Africa recognizes that sexual violence is inextricably linked to gender inequality. Therefore, we must strongly advocate for the equal participation and full involvement of women in peace processes, economic activity, and in more specific matters, such as the regulation and trade of arms. We should not neglect the collective calls for action outlined in the Beijing Declaration and Programme of Action that called for reductions in military expenditures and a reallocation of funds towards gender-responsive social and economic development programs. South Africa strongly agrees with the recommendation of the Secretary General to reduce military spending and utilize this fiscal space to reduce gender inequality and structural marginalization. Madam President, if we wish to eradicate sexual-related violence in conflict settings, we must do more to develop and support accountability mechanisms that are victim-centered. Accountability must improve the lives of victims and survivors. Accountability must also serve as a strong deterrent for those commanding military forces and having the power to support or oppose sexual violence. Madam President, security sector reform remains critical in ensuring that non-state actors do not gain access to illicit weapons, thus reducing their use in conflict-related sexual violence. In this regard, South Africa calls for the implementation of Security Council Resolution 2553 on security sector reform and governance, in particular the development of context-specific security sector reform strategies and programs that mainstream a gender perspective in terms of all pillars of the Women, Peace and Security agenda. South Africa's Women, Peace and Security National Action Plan includes an indicator relating to increasing the number of women trained in disarmament, and we would encourage other member states to further harmonize their Women, Peace and Security National Action Plans with the disarmament agenda. As I conclude, Madam President, South Africa wishes to reassert that it is critical that we adopt a holistic approach to uphold the human rights and fundamental freedoms of women and girls. Only then will we create the necessary focus to address this heinous crime. I thank you.
I thank the representative of South Africa, and I now give the floor to the representative of United Arab Emirates.
Madam President, I'd like to begin by thanking Malta for organizing this open debate and Deputy Prime Minister Fearne for presiding over this meeting. I also thank Special Representative Patten for her briefing. As a survivor of the Darfur genocide, Ms. Ahmadi exemplifies the resilience of Sudanese women and girls in the face of unimaginable suffering. Her participation underpins the very core of the WPS agenda. Women are not just victims, they are active agents of change and essential to peace and security. Allow me to also thank UN Goodwill Ambassador Gurira for her powerful remarks. Madam President, as made clear in the Secretary General's report and echoed by speakers today, crimes of conflict-related sexual violence remain rampant, and the proliferation of weapons contributes to this grim reality. Weapons are not only used to commit crimes of CRSV, but their illicit proliferation can indirectly fuel conflict, which in turn increases the likelihood of such crimes taking place. The United Arab Emirates unequivocally condemns all forms of sexual violence, not least of those perpetrated in conflict. In this regard, I would like to make 3 recommendations that focus on how gender-responsive arms control can help prevent CRSV. First, we must utilize all possible tools to address the scourge of CRSV and prevent the illicit flow of arms to armed groups, organized crime, and terrorist groups. The Security Council must ensure its sanctions regimes are strong and robust, with standalone designation criterion to impose targeted arms embargoes upon individuals and groups perpetrating sexual violence. The mandates of expert panels should include requisite gender expertise to better inform the Council of the gender impact on conflict. We should also leverage existing reporting mechanisms and technical expertise of entities from within the UN system, like UNODC and UNODA, to develop a more gender-responsive approach to this topic. Second, we must improve data and reporting on both crimes of CRSV and the proliferation of arms. By better understanding these 2 phenomena and their interlinkages, we can strengthen accountability for these heinous crimes. The importance of disaggregated data cannot be overstated. As we heard today, 70 to 90% of CRSV incidents involve small arms and light weapons. The existing challenges of reporting and data on CRSV are exacerbated with accelerated drawdowns of peacekeeping operations. Networks with local communities are all the more important to avoid compounding existing blind spots. Third, greater efforts to strengthen the gender-responsive aspects of Security Council security sector reform are required. Disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration and education programs must be equipped to combat gender stereotypes and negative social norms. This can directly address the root causes of CRSV. The design, development, and implementation of these programs must ensure the full, equal, and meaningful participation of women, particularly survivors of CRSV. Madam President, it is simply untenable that most perpetrators of conflict-related sexual violence have not been brought to justice to answer for their crimes. We must end the impunity that allows rape to be used as a weapon of war. In our efforts to prevent sexual violence and the illicit proliferation of weapons, to be forewarned is to be forearmed. The international community, and in particular this Council, must continue to implement the normative framework to eliminate these crimes once and for all, and the UAE remains fully committed towards this goal. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of the United Arab Emirates, and I now give the floor to the representative of Bangladesh.
Madam President, I thank the Presidency of Malta for convening today's open debate. I also thank the distinguished briefers for their insightful briefings and remarks. Madam President, significant efforts have been made by the United Nations in the last couple of years to address conflict-related sexual violence, including through the interagency network United Nations Action Against Sexual Violence in Conflict. However, the scourge of CRSV continues to remain a serious concern for the global community. With the rise of armed conflicts and proliferation of weapons, including small arms and light weapons, increase the risks of conflict-related sexual violence. Research has shown that approximately 70 to 90% of incidents of conflict-related sexual violence involve small arms and light weapons. It is therefore imperative for the Council to undertake and advance a gender-responsive demilitarization and non-proliferation agenda to end sexual violence in conflict. Madam President, Bangladesh went through the painful experience of conflict-related sexual violence during its War of Liberation in 1971. Over 200,000 women and girls bore its brunt. We had taken measures for their rehabilitation in 1972. The local perpetrators have been brought to justice through a trial process, and the contribution of the victims has been recognized officially. We are witnessing a repeat of that traumatic experience while hosting over 1 million forcibly displaced Rohingyas. Many of those Rohingya women faced sexual violence in Myanmar. Considering their specific needs, our National Action Plan on Women, Peace and Security has incorporated provisions for capacity building of local humanitarian actors on gender-responsive and victim-centered humanitarian actions. The Rohingya women have also been made part of our efforts to address various security threats in the camps, including threats of human trafficking. As we discuss conflict-related sexual violence, I cannot but express my delegation's deep concern at the current situation in Gaza, which has taken a severe toll on Palestinian women and girls. We are appalled by the credible allegations raised in the reports of UN experts that the Palestinian women and girls in detention centers have been subjected to multiple forms of sexual assault. We echo the calls of those experts to conduct an independent, impartial, prompt, thorough, and effective investigation into the allegations. Madam President, allow me to highlight some specific thoughts on today's topic. First, we would like to emphasize the importance of implementing Security Council resolutions on women, peace, and security, including in the context of disarmament and non-proliferation. In this regard, we wish to highlight the need for enhancing accountability and compliance and call for concrete actions from the Council to address non-compliance. Second, we echo the call for women's enhanced participation in ceasefire and political processes, security sector reform and arms control. We highlight the contribution of peacekeeping operations in engaging the women in security sector reform and disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration processes. We also support the recommendation of the Secretary General for dedicated operational provisions on addressing conflict-related sexual violence in mandate authorizations and renewals of peace operations, including those undergoing transitions and phased drawdowns. Third, we wish to recognize the important role of Peacebuilding Commission in strengthening the capacity of national institutions and stakeholders in prevention of sexual violence in conflict and advancing rehabilitation and reintegration of the survivors of CRSV. the Council can leverage PBC's advisory role, which is an effective platform for sharing best practices and strengthening CRSV prevention and response. Fourth, use of sexual violence as a weapon of war must be strongly condemned and accounted for. We call for ensuring justice and accountability for such crimes, including under the auspices of International Criminal Court. Finally, Madam President, ending conflict-related sexual violence would require a comprehensive strategy to advance political solutions to armed conflicts, as well as greater efforts towards achieving general and complete disarmament. The Council must remain focused in fulfilling its primary responsibility to end armed conflict, including by preventing its abatement through supply of arms to the parties in conflict. To conclude, I wish to reiterate my country's full commitment to the UN's gender-responsive disarmament agenda and our support to all global efforts for ending sexual violence in conflict. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Bangladesh, and I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Stavros Lambrinidis, Head of the Delegation of the European Union to the United Nations.
Thank you, Madam President. I have the honour to speak on behalf of the European Union and its member states, the candidate countries Montenegro, Albania, Ukraine, the Republic of Moldova, Bosnia and Herzegovina, and Georgia, as well as Andorra, Monaco, and San Marino, align themselves with this statement. This year's report from the Secretary-General unveils a distressing surge in incidents of conflict-related sexual violence, exacerbated by the proliferation of arms and increased militarization. Urgent action is necessary for all member states to fulfill their relevant disarmament, non-proliferation and arms export control obligations. When making an export assessment, we must take into account the risks of the arms being used to commit or facilitate serious acts of sexual and gender-based violence, including against women and children. We need to integrate considerations on sexual violence and gender equality into related legislative, policy and implementation frameworks, and that is paramount. This can only be achieved with the full, equal and meaningful participation of women themselves in those processes. The Arms Trade Treaty explicitly requires state parties to duly take into account the risks of sexual and gender-based violence in arms export assessments, which in turn contributes to the prevention of conflict-related sexual violence. Let me tell you a couple of things about the European Union's action here. The EU has backed all this up with financing. For example, by allocating 4.5 million for the implementation of the UN Programme of Action on Small Arms and Light Weapons and its international tracing instrument focusing on global policy, regional implementation, and gender-responsive strategies. Additionally, our civilian common security and defence policy missions address women, peace and security issues alongside disarmament, non-proliferation, and arms export control efforts. For instance, the EU advisory mission in Ukraine recently organized seminars related to illicit arms trade. The EU border assistance mission in Libya mainstreams a gender perspective into their small arms and light weapons trafficking and dissemination trainings. Madam President, a gender-responsive approach to prevention and addressing conflict-related sexual violence must be firmly at the heart of arms control, in particular regarding small arms and light weapons, to prevent the culture of impunity that shields perpetrators from accountability. Accountability goes beyond just punishing the perpetrators. It means recognizing and addressing the systemic factors that enable sexual violence to flourish in conflict settings. The European Union is committed to ending impunity for conflict-related sexual violence and ensuring justice at both the international and domestic level in a manner that takes into account the trauma inflicted on the victims, places survivors at the center, and upholds human rights and fair trial standards. September, Madam President, marks the 15th anniversary of the establishment of the Office of the Special Representative and the creation of the United Nations team of experts. Let us use this anniversary to redouble our efforts to strengthen multilateral institutions and civil society organizations that are working to ensure accountability for conflict-related sexual violence. Moreover, let us commit to ensuring that resources match the global need to deliver justice for survivors and end these atrocities once and for all. Due attention should also be given to guarantees of non-recurrence. States should take tangible action here, for example, through institutional reforms, disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration processes. We need security sector reform that emphasizes internal accountability and promotes effective civilian oversight. The Secretary General's new guidance note on transitional justice provides useful direction in this regard. The United Nations also has other tools at hand. We emphasize the notable potential of the new Agenda for Peace, which provides an opportunity for gender-responsive action on these questions, including by the Security Council. Furthermore, a gender-responsive approach should guide the 4th Review Conference of the Programme of Action on SALW and its international tracing instrument due to take place in New York this June. Madam President, finally, while prioritizing civilian protection, we must always remember that preventing conflicts remains the most effective means of ending conflict-related sexual violence. The European Union is committed to fostering peace and security both within our borders and globally for the benefit of all peoples and all nations. Thank you.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Lambrinidis for his statement. I now give the floor to the Netherlands.
Thank you, Madam President. I have the honor to deliver this statement on behalf of the member states of the UN LGBTI Core Group. 2 years ago, the UN LGBTI Core Group raised our concerns that despite the frameworks put in place by the Security Council to prevent and address sexual and gender-based violence in conflict, the level of compliance by parties to conflict remains insufficient and impunity prevails. We are deeply troubled that despite consistently raising our concerns, conflict-related sexual violence against LGBTI persons persists. We reiterate that sexual violence against all persons is prohibited under international humanitarian law and is a violation of international human rights law. It does not discriminate against gender identity and sexual orientation, and all persons must be protected. We call on all parties to conflicts to respect international law. Perpetrators of conflict-related sexual violence often assume LGBTI persons will not have their rights guarantees and will have little access to justice mechanisms. We are here to tell them that they are wrong. Victims and survivors of conflict-related sexual violence are not a homogeneous group. Women, girls, men, boys, persons of diverse gender identities, persons with diverse sexual orientations, as well as persons living with disabilities have all been targeted by armed actors. And the majority of them come from socioeconomically marginalized communities. Last year, the UN Secretary General identified in his report lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, and intersex persons being at serious risk of sexual violence in conflict-affected and displacement settings. This year, the Secretary General reports the risks as acute, signifying increased risks of conflict-related sexual violence experienced by LGBTI persons. As stated by the Secretary General, Member States need to undertake an intersectional analysis and a tailored, survivor-centered approach to address conflict-related sexual violence. We must also build forensic capacity to strengthen investigations and accountability for perpetrators. Therefore, we encourage all Member States to again review their legal frameworks so that collectively we adequately address the needs of survivors in all their diversity with a tailored, survivor-centered approach. This means providing access to justice and remedy, as well as essential health services, including sexual and reproductive health services. This means changes in legislation and decriminalization of LGBTI persons. This means addressing the chronic underreporting and documentation of conflict-related sexual violence and making it easier to report cases of violence against LGBTI persons without fear of reprisals. We also encourage Member States to develop and invest in long-term partnerships with LGBTI civil society organizations, to monitor and report, and to deliver support services to LGBTI survivors of conflict-related sexual violence. The UN LGBTI Core Group reiterates the importance of ensuring universal respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms of all individuals without distinction. We will empower survivors by prioritizing their specific needs, perspectives, and aspirations, and consider intersecting inequalities, including sexual orientation and gender identity. LGBTI survivors' rights must be respected and will be protected. I thank you.
The representative of the Netherlands. I now give the floor to the representative of Chile.
Madam President, we thank Malta for convening this open debate, and we note the presentation made by the briefers and by the other member states. Recognising that sexual violence has been and continues to be used as a tactic of war, systematically in a reiterated manner in armed conflict, gives visibility to a serious situation which affects international peace and security. This Security Council has expressed the fact that sexual violence can exacerbate and significantly prolong situations of armed conflict and stand in the way of re-establishing peace. It is not tolerable on the part of the international community that such conduct be normalised, nor that it be accepted as a collateral of war or situations of internal crisis. Sexual violence constitutes a serious element which is present in societies which are in the process of rebuilding peace, and it requires a specialised strategy for it to redress it. In turn, conflict-related sexual violence is closely linked to gender inequality and discrimination, as faced by women and girls in many societies. There is a need for programmes and policies which promote gender equality, the empowerment of women, and the eradication of all forms of discrimination. We welcome the fact that Agenda 2030 for Sustainable Development provides a global framework to tackle such questions. It is regrettable to note that in the last 5 years there has been an increase in sexual violence against women and girls in situations of armed conflict. Without a doubt, this is due to a weakening of the rule of law, which creates a climate of impunity. However, the correlation between the increase of indicators on sexual violence against women and girls and armed conflict can be found not only rooted in a context of prevailing violence, but also in other causes linked to gender and its intersectionalities. We note with concern the disproportionate increase in military expenditure over recent years, alongside the high cost of maintaining nuclear arsenals, which undermines human security, particularly that of women and girls. In this regard, only a decisive commitment to the non-proliferation and disarmament agenda, which involves the elimination of nuclear weapons and the reduction of military budgets, can guarantee security to diverse gender perspectives to ensure collective peace and security. In this regard, we are concerned regarding massive transfers of weapons to countries in conflict over recent years. It is imperative to promote disarmament and improve arms control. The proliferation of small arms and light weapons is a factor which significantly contributes to conflict-related sexual violence. This body, and also regional organisations, must promote and implement measures for disarmament, demobilisation and reintegration of combatants, as well as the effective control of the trade in small arms and light weapons. Madam President, to conclude, we deem it imperative to improve the collection of data on armed violence against women, including a gender approach, so as to guide public policy on prevention and protection. Compiling statistics related to weapons with a gender perspective must include a disaggregated set of information on things like purchase, the type and ownership of firearms, and details on links between victims and victimizers, connected crimes and elements of intersectionality which can increase the vulnerability of specific groups of women. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Chile for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Luxembourg.
Madam President, I would like to thank Malta for organizing this critical debate. I have the honor to deliver this statement on behalf of the Benelux countries, Belgium, the Kingdom of the Netherlands, and my own country, Luxembourg. we align ourselves with the statements of the EU, the Group of Friends of WPS, and the LGBTI core group. We thank SRSG Patten for her briefing and reiterate our full support to the mandate of her office. Allow me to extend special gratitude to today's civil society briefers for their indispensable work. Madam President, despite the existing normative framework on conflict-related sexual violence, this year's SG report once again describes a worrying surge of incidents of CRSV across the world. Against the background of these trends, it is key to focus on how we can prevent occurrences of sexual violence related to conflicts. Please allow me to highlight 3 areas for action. Firstly, to eliminate conflict-related sexual violence, we need to address its root causes. CRSV often arises in contexts marked by power asymmetry, patriarchy, and impunity. Arms proliferation and illicit trade of small arms and light weapons are factors that aggravate CRSV. Prevention strategies must tackle all these root causes, taking into account the interlinkages between militarization and gender inequality. Secondly, cooperation across national borders must become the norm. In this light, we welcome the first ever International Conference of Prosecutors on Accountability for CRSV, which was hosted by the Netherlands last month in partnership with the Office of the SRSG and her team of experts. The meeting brought together prosecutors and legal practitioners from 32 member states to share experiences from their domestic court system, to translate commitments of this council into concrete realities on the ground. The lessons learned from this conference will also provide valuable input to work towards a community of practice for CRSV prosecutors that can help enhance implementation. As we approach the 15th anniversary of the United Nations mandate on sexual violence in conflict, we invite all member states to redouble efforts to ensure justice for the victims and survivors of CRSV. Thirdly, CRSV prevention can be improved by enhancing conditions for the full, equal and meaningful participation of women in SSR and DDR, including in leadership roles. Underrepresentation of women and historically marginalized communities in the field of new technologies, including the arms industries, generate bias and imbalances. The Benelux countries aim to ensure strong gender commitments in the upcoming review conference on small arms and light weapons. Preventing, combating, and eradicating the illicit trade in small arms and light weapons requires mainstreaming a gender perspective into implementation efforts of member states to specifically address the gendered impact of the illicit trade. It is essential to adopt a concerted approach in all multilateral fora, also in the framework of the Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons, the Arms Trade Treaty, and in this Council under the WPS agenda. Madam President, to conclude, we wish to reiterate our strong engagement to protect global generational gains on the rights of all women and girls. We owe it to the victims and survivors to do our best to prevent and eliminate CRSV by taking concrete action and move forward, not go backwards. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Luxembourg for their statements and now give the floor to the representative of Indonesia.
Madam President, allow me to thank Malta for convening today's open debate and the briefers for their insight. Reports on the increase of conflict-related sexual violence, or CRSV, are indeed concerning. We also note with deep concern UNIDIR's study that this increase is further fueled by the proliferation, diversion, and misuse of small arms and light weapons in conflict zones, as 70 to 90% of CRSV incidents are reported to involve weapons. This underscores the gravity of this situation and the need to take a holistic view to address this challenge. Allow me to underline a few points in this regard. First, national ownership and capacity is key to ensure a sustainable solution. International support to build national capacity in eliminating CRSV and combating illicit trade of SALW is thus crucial. In doing so, we must bear in mind that there is no one-size-fits-all. Each conflict situation should be viewed on a case-by-case basis. Capacity building measures must be tailored to the actual needs of the country. In this regard, we need to advance a comprehensive approach that includes security sector reform as well as demobilization, disarmament, and reintegration that will help to transform national institutions to be accountable and gender-sensitive in post-conflict situations, as well as reduce the risk of relapsing into conflict and effectively will prevent CRSV. Second, the role of peace operations in addressing CRSV must be supported. Such a role can be embedded as part of their mandates to protect civilians. Monitoring arrangements and CRSV early warning indicators could also be incorporated into their protection structures. Female peacekeepers could play an important role in this regard, among others by providing a stronger sense of affinity and protection for the victims. Indonesia also welcomes the deployment of women's protection advisors in 10 peace operations. We hope this good example could be replicated in other missions. Third, the need to promote regional and global cooperation. Exchanges of best practices and collaborations among regional organizations can contribute to mitigating CRSV and advancing the WPS agenda. In our region, we have adopted ASEAN Regional Plan of Action to advance the WPS agenda that can serve as a building block in the implementation of the global WPS agenda, as well as to prevent CRSV. Finally, Madam President, there is a need for synergy among all relevant processes in the UN. As we head towards the 4th review conference of the Plan of Action for the Small Arms and Light Weapons, today's deliberation on the impact of small arms and light weapons to conflict-related sexual violence could be considered in the formulation, implementation, and evaluation of the POA to eventually eradicate their illicit trade. The Security Council must continue to work together with other relevant UN bodies to ensure CRSV prevention measures are effectively implemented. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Indonesia for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Brazil.
Thank you. Madam President, I thank Malta for organizing this open debate. I also thank Special Representative Pramila Patten for her tireless efforts in mainstreaming a gender perspective in arms control and disarmament, with a view to reducing the flow of weapons that facilitates conflict-related sexual and gender-based violence. Guaranteeing the equal participation of women from all regions, notably from developing countries, in decision-making institutions and fora is beneficial to all. In this respect, we commend the recent appointment by the Secretary-General of the Brazilian prosecutor, Ms. Najila Nassif Palma, for the position of UN Victims' Rights Advocate. Madam President, diversion, illicit trafficking, and misuse of small arms and light weapons and ammunition continue to fuel violence worldwide, with an acute and differentiated impact on women and girls. Brazil supports gender-sensitive language in peacekeeping operations and special political missions to ensure protection of civilians and preventing conflict-related sexual violence. Cross-leveraging disarmament and women, peace and security frameworks is critical. We commend the UN Institute for Disarmament Research for its efforts in raising awareness on gender-related issues on arms control and disarmament, such as diversity among policymakers and gender gaps in public opinion on nuclear weapons. It is key to secure women's full, equal, and meaningful participation in decision-making processes in arms control and disarmament fora. States must consider this in the upcoming review of the Program of Action on Small Arms and Light Weapons next June. Madam President, in its 11 mandates in this Council, Brazil has proudly sponsored some of the most significant initiatives to enhance accountability to perpetrators of conflict-related sexual violence and promote survivors' access to justice. For instance, we helped craft Council Resolution 1960 of 2010 on sexual violence in armed conflict, increasing this organ's role in monitoring the inclusion of judicial reparations for those crimes in peace processes. Also, as chair of the 1533 Sanctions Committee in 2011, Brazil accepted the request from then Special Representative Margot Wallström to strengthen measures against perpetrators of conflict-related sexual violence in line with Resolution 1807 of 2008. Listing perpetrators of such crimes is a key prevention tool, as long as this prerogative is exercised with maximum restraint and with due regard for the rights of the listed individuals to defend themselves through the regime's ombudspersons. Additionally, as listing alone is not sufficient to bring perpetrators to justice, survivors of sexual violence should be supported in accessing justice and obtaining reparations. As chair of the Peacebuilding Commission, Brazil stands ready to collaborate with the Security Council on the shared responsibility to combat conflict-related sexual violence. The PBC must play its leading role in women, peace, and security. We hope it will resume its participation at the next annual open debate on WPS. Madam President, Brazil is committed to implementing WPS resolutions in all its dimensions, even going beyond its scope. Our second National Action Plan on Women, Peace and Security covers not only foreign policy actions, but also a broad range of issues of major importance for the Brazilian society, including promoting a safer, less violent environment for Brazilian women. This is a goal that every member state should pursue as well. I thank you.
The representative of Brazil for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Lithuania.
Madam President, Lithuania aligns itself with the EU statement. I would like to add the following remarks in our national capacity. Lithuania fully supports the efforts of Secretary General Special Representative Pramila Patten, and I thank her and her other distinguished briefers for their statement today. In line with the UN commitment to put an end to sexual violence in conflict situations, the government of Lithuania has been continuously providing financial contributions to the UN action against sexual violence in conflict. We are keen on strengthening our cooperation and exploring avenues for additional collective initiatives aimed at holding accountable all perpetrators for their actions while ensuring a survivor-centered approach. Madam President, this year's report from the Secretary General on the conflict-related sexual violence underscores the direct correlation between the proliferation of arms, illicit trafficking of weapons, and the rise in incidents of sexual violence. Once again, it is demonstrated that the incorporating a gender perspective into discussions regarding arms, non-proliferation, holds strategic significance. Indeed, this is significant in advancing global peace, security, and gender parity. The report notes that kidnapping and trafficking for sexual exploitation are not only horrific wartime tactics, they also serve as a revenue stream for perpetrators. Regrettably, impunity for conflict-related sexual violence persists as the norm. The societal stigma surrounding the issue also remains prevalent. Adopting a survivor-centered approach is vital. Employing intersectional analysis and tailored strategies is also vital. The report of the Secretary General is focused on 15 countries for which information verified by the United Nations exists. We find alarming the perpetration of conflict-related sexual violence cases by the 58 parties listed. Lithuania condemns in the strongest possible terms Hamas' brutal and indiscriminate terrorist attack across Israel on 7th October 2023. This includes instances of rape and gang rape. We urge Hamas to release all hostages and ensure their protection. All alleged violations must be investigated without further delay. Perpetrators must be brought to justice. Madam President, the ongoing Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine continues to yield harrowing testimonies of sexual violence against the civilian population, detainees, and the prisoners of war. This includes testimonies in the recent Commission of Inquiry report. The new evidence gathered strengthens the Commission's previous findings that torture used by Russian authorities in Ukraine and the Russian Federation has been widespread and systematic. What further evidence of the horrifying accounts from victims of sexual violence must be heard before we decisively act to stop the aggressor? Given the widespread evidence of Russia's forces weaponizing conflict-related sexual violence, it is imperative to include certain subjects in the Secretary General report annexes. These are military as well as Federal Security Service and Federal Penitentiary Services units responsible for rape, the war crime of sexual violence, which also amounted to torture. The anonymity and impunity of the perpetrators only encourage the vicious cycle of violence. Victims deserve justice and redress. Madam President, it is imperative to use all tools to prevent conflict-related sexual violence. Lithuania supports a gender-sensitive approach to the control of small arms and light weapons. We recall the role that SALV plays in domestic and gender-based violence. We are highly concerned by the recent UNIDIR estimate The estimate states that in certain countries, between 70 to 90% of conflict-related sexual violence incidents involve weapons, particularly firearms. Lithuania calls upon all states to fully implement the Arms Trade Treaty. Prior to authorizing arms exports, this treaty requires a comprehensive risk assessment. The assessment must evaluate whether the arms could facilitate serious gender-based violence or violence against women and children. Lithuania remains committed to implementing the Women, Peace and Security Agenda nationally and internationally. We support and promote its international implementation. We commend all women on the front lines of the fight for democracy, peace and security. Peaceful, resilient and inclusive societies can only be built with full, equal and meaningful participation and leadership of women in peace and security efforts. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of Lithuania, and I will give the floor to the representative of Estonia.
Madam President, I would like to thank Malta for organizing this open debate and for briefers for their presentations. Estonia aligns itself with a statement delivered by the European Union. Please allow me to add a few elements on my national capacity. Madam President, it is evident that rather remarkable erosion of existing international arms control framework is taking place. Lack of mutual trust is surging and the arms control agreements are violated across the globe, including by a permanent member of this very council, Russia. Conditions for effective demilitarization and disarmament are often neglected. At the same time, effective combating of conflict-related sexual violence requires precisely demilitarization, gender-responsive arms control, and disarmament. Madam President, throughout last year, we've sadly witnessed the sexual violence continues to be almost universally accepted tactic of warfare, terror and humiliation, from conflict in Africa and the Middle East to Asia and South America. In Europe, documented, systematic and widespread use of sexual violence continues to be an integral part of Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine. For over 2 years, Russia's soldiers, mercenaries and occupational authorities, with Kremlin's blessing, have been killing, torturing and raping Ukrainian civilians and prisoners of war. Based on the crimes mentioned in the Secretary General's report, it is an enigma why Russian armed forces and law enforcement agencies are not listed in the annexes of this very report as a party committing acts of rape and other forms of sexual violence. We condemn the sexual violence committed by Hamas against civilians on the 7th of October and call for immediate release of all hostages. We urge all countries to strictly abide by international humanitarian law and unequivocally condemn all forms of conflict-related sexual violence wherever it occurs. Madam President, Estonia underlines the important role of international accountability mechanisms, including the International Criminal Court. Estonia strongly supports establishing special tribunals to prosecute war crimes and crimes against humanity, including conflict-related sexual violence. We support applying targeted arms embargoes to actors that are listed as credibly suspected perpetrators of conflict-related sexual violence. We also strongly urge the inclusion of sexual violence as a designation criteria in relevant sanctions regimes. In addition, Estonia has been a steadfast supporter and donor of a team of experts on the rule of law and sexual violence in conflict. Their work in the DRC, Guinea, Ukraine, and other regions affected by conflict-related sexual violence is admirable. Madam President, I must also stress the importance and urgency of ensuring women's full, equal, and meaningful participation at all levels of decision-making, in peace negotiations as well as in arms control. Estonia is a co-sponsor of the first committee resolution on women, disarmament, non-proliferation, and arms control, and its subsequent resolutions that highlight the need and importance of inclusive approach. Finally, I can ensure that Estonia will continue its dedicated efforts to combat conflict-related sexual violence, including throughout support to the Special Representative of the Secretary General. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Estonia, and I will give the floor to the representative of the Dominican Republic.
Madam President, I wish to express my gratitude to Malta for convening this debate and underscore the leadership and work of Ms. Pramila Patten and her team, and also express gratitude to the other briefers for their valuable contributions. The Dominican Republic reiterates its commitment to eliminating sexual and gender-based violence in all its forms, during peacetime and at war. It is clear that this continues to be a noxious and devastating scourge, which stands as a reminder of the urgent need for action and collective action. There is abundant evidence of an alarming link between the proliferation of small arms and light weapons and the prevalence of sexual violence in conflict. This must lead to the urgent adoption of strategies to tackle both the availability of these weapons and the protection of vulnerable populations, particularly women and girls, in conflict zones. Madam President, the expeditious deployment of women's protection advisors in peace operations is crucial to provide an effective gender-responsive response to gender needs in conflict situations. We welcome the establishment of dedicated monitoring mechanisms indicating early warning indicators within the protection frameworks of the peace missions and policies. This is fundamental. Madam President, as stated in the report, over 70% of those involved in conflicts, the conflicts mentioned in the report, are persistent perpetrators. In other words, they have been on the list for 5 years or more without taking any corrective measures. This is clear evidence of the lack of accountability and the impunity which prevail in many of these contexts. It is essential to adopt approaches which comprise prevention, protection, justice, support for survivors, and which establish legal frameworks which criminalize these acts and guarantee accountability. Madam President, it is fundamental to empower local communities and to involve men and boys as allies in this fight, so as to achieve inclusive and sustainable change. Bringing an end to this horrific crime is the responsibility of all. In this regard, we wish to recognise the work of women civil society organisations, who are often the first to respond in times of war and conflict. Finally, I wish to recall that behind each one of these figures and statistics which appear in the report, there are human stories of pain, resilience, and struggle. Each number reflects a life devastated by violence, a community traumatized by conflict, and a hope for justice and peace, which is yearning for fulfillment. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the Dominican Republic, and I now give the floor to the representative of India.
Thank you, Madam President. In the realm of global peace and security, the intersection of gender and conflict is a critical area that demands our attention. United Nations Security Council Resolution 1325 of 2000 laid the foundation for recognizing both the impact of armed conflict on women and the indispensable role that they can play in peace building. One of the central aspects of this resolution was in addressing conflict-related sexual violence, a brutal weapon frequently used against women during conflicts. And Madam President, in recent decades, conflicts have become more fragmented and the theatre of conflict much more complex and volatile. Yet, the integration of a gender perspective into our collective efforts for conflict prevention, recovery, and reconstruction is still lacking. reducing military presence is a crucial step towards preventing conflict-related sexual violence. Demilitarization, intertwined with disarmament, calls for gender-responsive arms control. This approach recognizes the role of weapons proliferation in conflict-related sexual violence, advocating for arms control policies that address the specific vulnerabilities of women. An effective implementation requires a multifaceted approach involving community engagement, particularly with women, in security and disarmament decisions. Now, turning to India's own commitments, our nation's dedication to the Women, Peace and Security agenda is demonstrated through a comprehensive approach to combating conflict-related sexual violence. This approach includes international collaborations, national policy reforms, and grassroots-level initiatives. At the international level, India has contributed significantly to UN peacekeeping missions and has been very vocal about the need to incorporate gender perspectives into peace and security policies. I'm proud to mention that India was the very first country to deploy an all-women formed police unit to Liberia in 2007 under a UN mission. Indian female peacekeepers have played a crucial mentoring role in preventing conflict-related sexual violence, and we also take immense pride that Major Suman Gavani was awarded the UN Military Gender Advocate of the Year in 2019. India was also the first country to contribute to the Secretary General's Trust Fund in support of victims of sexual exploitation and abuse, and had also signed the Voluntary Compact on Sexual Exploitation and Abuse with the Secretary General in 2017. Madam President, recognizing the pivotal role of empowered women as agents of change, the Indian government has very recently amended its constitution to reserve 1/3 of the seats in national and state legislatures for women, underscoring their crucial contributions to peace and security. And during its presidency of the G20, might I remind this Council, India had drawn the international community's attention to women-led development with a focus on women's empowerment and gender equality. The establishment of the G20 Women's Empowerment Working Group represents a most promising development in this regard. Madam President, I will conclude by stating that combating conflict-related sexual violence demands a multifaceted strategy that integrates prevention, survivor support, perpetrator accountability, and societal change regarding gender-based violence. It necessitates collaborative efforts from governments, international entities, civil society, and individuals to ensure women's rights and peaceful conflict resolution in the effort to indeed relegate conflict-related sexual violence to a bygone era. Thank you.
I thank the representative of India for their statements. I now give the floor to the representative of Latvia.
Madam President, Latvia thanks the leadership of Malta in organising this debate. We align ourselves with the statement delivered by the European Union and wish to make a few additional remarks. It is a fact. Armed conflicts expose civilians to conflict-related sexual violence. It is being weaponized as tactics of war. State and non-state armed groups target civilians with sexual violence, abuse, rape, torture, often at gunpoint, in the streets, in their homes, in captivity. The Secretary General's annual report describes horrifying accounts of conflict-related sexual violence in 19 countries and territories, including Afghanistan, Israel, Palestine, Sudan, Ukraine, and the list goes on. It is also a fact that women and girls are disproportionately affected by sexual violence. Yet, when it comes to decision-making forums, women's voices are largely missing. Madam President, for Latvia, it is clear full respect for the rule of law is paramount to ending conflict-related sexual violence. Humanitarian law, Security Council resolutions, rulings of the ICJ are legally binding and must be implemented. Yet we see complete disregard for the rule of law in places of war and conflict. For example, Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine reports about routine acts of sexual violence committed by Russian military in Ukraine. In territories under Russian control, the family members and victims who complained to the Russian commanders have been shot dead. When crimes are committed, accountability must follow. Latvia has initiated national criminal proceedings for these cases and is a member of the joint investigation team, helping several other countries and the ICC to gather evidence on these Russian crimes. Madam President, the link between conflict-related sexual violence and illicit small arms and light weapons is well established. In this regard, we applaud last year's adoption of the Global Framework for Ammunition Management. It is also important, equally important, to strengthen the existing instruments, such as the Programme of Action on Small Arms and Light Weapons. This year's Small Arms and Light Weapons Review Conference presents an opportunity for that. As a member of the Bureau, Latvia is advocating for gender-responsive assessment of Programme of Action and a meaningful involvement of women in the process. To conclude, I can assure you Latvia will continue to actively work to strengthen the rule of law, gender-responsive arms control, involvement of women in decision-making, and to end conflict-related sexual violence and impunity. We must spare no effort to achieve it. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Latvia for their statements. I now give the floor to the representative of Spain.
Señora Presidenta.
Madam President, Spain thanks you for convening this open debate, this annual open debate, and align itself with the statements of the European Union and the Group of Friends. The militarization and the illicit transfer of arms has increased over recent years, exposing civilians, and particularly women and girls, to greater levels of sexual violence and destabilizing contexts which were already fragile. The United Nations Institute for Disarmament Research estimates that between 70% and 90% of incidents of conflict-related sexual violence involve weapons and firearms. In most of these cases, impunity remains the norm. Bringing an end to this requires work on preventive diplomacy, as stated by the Secretary-General in our common agenda. The Women, Peace and Security agenda is, above all, an agenda of prevention. We believe that mediation and disarmament are the principal tools which can underpin the rest of the measures, and therefore we continue to work on creating and promoting networks of women mediators with a regional approach. Conflicts such as that of Ukraine clearly show the risks of nuclear proliferation. Spain therefore remains committed to the Stockholm Initiative, which promotes the participation of women in nuclear disarmament. Disarmament and gender-responsive arms control with a gender perspective can help to prevent gender violence, making it fundamental to introduce this perspective into the main arms control instruments and to reflect this in the national action plans. Spain recognises the importance of the United Nations Programme of Action on Small Arms and Light Weapons, which recommends the collection of data on the impact of the illicit trade of small arms and light weapons by gender and by age. And we hope that the fourth conference is an opportunity to examine progress made in the implementation of this, and to discuss ways to continue stepping up efforts to prevent and eradicate the illicit traffic of small arms and light weapons. We also recognise the great importance of the Arms Trade Treaty, which requires states to deny authorization for arms exports if they believe that there is a risk that these may be used for acts of sexual or gender-based violence. We welcome the draft Global Framework of 2023 to manage conventional ammunition throughout their life cycle, which was recently adopted. One of its objectives calls for the full, equal, significant and effective participation of women in managing conventional ammunition throughout their life cycle, thus filling a regulatory vacuum at international level. On a national level, one of our national action plans includes a measure to incorporate the gender perspective into the disarmament, demobilisation and reintegration initiatives and into the non-proliferation of small arms and light weapons through the participation of women in these initiatives and in training personnel. Our first national action plan includes the need to incorporate gender into mine control measures, and the second into the control of small arms and light weapons. On the 24th of May, we will celebrate the International Day of Women for Peace and Disarmament to commemorate the leadership and participation of women in this field. As stated in Resolution 2242, adopted in 2015 under the Spanish presidency of the Council, we must empower women, including through capacity building, so that they participate in the design and implementation of initiatives aimed to prevent and eradicate the illicit transfer of small arms, if we wish to see more just and peaceful societies. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Spain for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Canada.
Thank you very much, Madam President. I am today pleased to speak on behalf of the group of Friends of Women, Peace and Security, representing all 5 regional groups at the United Nations, as well as the European Union. On their behalf, I wish to highlight 5 points. First, that we categorically condemn the use of conflict-related sexual violence by state and by non-state actors, acts which disproportionately impact women and girls in conflict-affected settings, including humanitarian crises. We are deeply concerned that the illicit trafficking, dissemination, and widespread availability of small arms and light weapons and their ammunition, as well as violations of arms embargoes, have facilitated incidents of conflict-related sexual violence. We call on all parties in all conflict situations to respect international law and to refrain from all violations and abuses, including those involving all forms of conflict-related sexual violence. We can continue to urge the Security Council to use all the tools at its disposal to prevent and respond to all forms of sexual and gender-based violence. We also support the mandate of the Special Representative of the Secretary General on Sexual Violence in Conflict, who I'm pleased to see here today, and the UN team of experts on the rule of law and sexual violence in conflict. Second, we strongly call for the full, equal, meaningful, and safe participation of women in all peace and security processes and at all levels, which is, if I may say so, Madam President, not the case at the moment. This includes the participation in the design, the development, and implementation of disarmament, non-proliferation, and arms control efforts, as well as mainstreaming and applying a gender perspective. We expect that the forthcoming review conference of the UN Program on Action to Prevent, Combat, and Eradicate the Illicit Trade in Small Arms and Light Weapons in all its aspects will represent an important milestone in this regard. Third, we call on member states to implement all of their relevant disarmament and non-proliferation and arms control obligations, including taking into account, when making an export assessment, the risk of the arms being used to commit or facilitate serious acts of sexual and gender-based violence or violence against women and children. Fourth, the rights and agency of victims and survivors of conflict-related sexual violence needs to be fully respected and prioritized. It is essential that they, as well as all other survivors of sexual and gender-based violence, can access justice and comprehensive services, including sexual and reproductive health care services, mental health and psychosocial support, and legal services. We remain committed to removing all barriers that prevent victims and survivors from safely reporting sexual violence and from accessing essential services. Fifth, impunity for such abhorrent acts and such terrible violence and such terrible trauma must end. This entails strengthening the rule of law, addressing harmful social norms and discriminatory laws, ensuring the protection of all civilians, and committing to undertake a prompt and independent investigation of conflict-related sexual violence and accountability for all those responsible. Madam President, we reiterate our commitment to prevent and respond to all acts of sexual and gender-based violence in conflict settings. We must take urgent action. Madame la Présidente.
Madam President, I wish to also take this opportunity to state a few words in my national capacity. Canada is particularly cognizant of the grave consequences from sexual violence related to conflicts in Sudan, in Ukraine, in Haiti, in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, in Israel, in Gaza, and elsewhere, unfortunately, throughout the world. In Haiti, armed gangs have been perpetrating acts of violence and sexual exploitation. These acts have been facilitated by access to light weapons. The purpose is to expand their territorial control to urban areas. Canada firmly condemns the use of conflict-related sexual violence as a tactic of war, of torture, and terrorism in all situations of armed conflict. We call on all parties to conflict to end these heinous crimes. Thank you, Madam President. Thank you.
Thank the representative of Canada for their statements. I now give the floor to the representative of Panama.
Thank you, Madam President. As a nation committed to defending human rights and promoting gender equality, Panama recognizes the devastating impact of sexual violence in armed conflict, which affects individuals, families, and communities, particularly those in situations of marginalization. This generates a chain of consequences which last much longer than the conflict. To tackle such situations, it is fundamental to focus on the root causes which feed into them and which precede them, such as discrimination, persecution, hate speech, and deep-rooted gender inequality. These are conditions which are often exacerbated by the influence of organized crime, which seeks to exploit and perpetuate armed conflicts for their own ends. There is a shared responsibility both in multinational and national spaces, to work to raise awareness and prevent such crimes. This requires the cooperation of multiple protagonists, bearing in mind its cross-cutting nature. We recognize the urgent need to establish comprehensive gender-sensitive measures and measures for control of arms and disarmament, including the illicit trafficking of weapons, to prevent and tackle such crimes in an effective way. Panama underscores the importance of the participation and leadership of women and young people in arms control and disarmament efforts, including in international fora. Women play a vital role in conflict prevention, resolution, and in building lasting peace. Their full, equal, and significant inclusion in decision-making processes with regard to arms control is essential to guarantee that policies and strategies are gender sensitive and tackle the needs, experiences, and specific vulnerabilities of women, young people, and girls affected by armed conflict. This includes ensuring that there is true rule of law and governance by national institutions, which is fundamental to build response capacity and to move forward with credible, inclusive accountability processes for crimes committed in the past, and to prevent such crimes being committed in the future, as well as to guarantee access to justice and adequate health services, including mental health services for victims. Likewise, we underscore the critical role of arms control in peace operations and processes. Effective disarmament frameworks can contribute significantly to reducing and preventing the risk of sexual violence by limiting access to arms and ammunition used to perpetrate such crimes. We call for sustained investment in security sector reform and in programs of disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration during transition periods, so as to guarantee the successful reintegration of former combatants into society and to prevent a resurgence of violence. To this end, we agree that peacekeeping missions play a fundamental role in preventing and responding to such violence. given that through their presence on the ground, they can contribute to closely monitoring the human rights situation, and they can work with national and local authorities to prevent and address sexual violence, as well as to carrying out investigations so that the actions and strategies be underpinned by evidence, thus providing timely, effective responses in conflict and post-conflict situations. Panama also recognizes the importance of harmonizing national strategies to promote the Women, Peace and Security agenda, harmonizing this with disarmament efforts. If we align such frameworks, we can improve the effectiveness of mechanisms to prevent and respond to conflict-related sexual violence. The close relationship this has with promoting gender equality and empowering women, as reflected in SDG 5, and promoting effective institutions, as reflected in SDG 16, clearly attests to its importance and the need to prioritize it in national and international political agendas. In this regard, we insist on the importance of prioritizing the integration of gender perspectives into all aspects of arms control and disarmament policies, and promoting better synergy with other international instruments, including the Arms Trade Treaty and the Programme of Action to prevent and combat and eradicate the illicit trade in small arms and light weapons in all its aspects, as well as the CEDAW and the Beijing Platform of Action. Decisive decisions must be adopted to prevent any situations of conflict-related sexual violence. The United Nations agencies can work with national authorities to provide training in prevention and in the design of mechanisms which provide responses which are in line with the needs of those affected, as well as regarding policies for the restoration of rights. We believe that improved cooperation and coordination between states, international organizations, civil society and other stakeholders are essential to develop holistic, sustainable solutions to this pressing issue. The responses must be holistic, not piecemeal, because rights are indivisible and intrinsically linked. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of Panama for their statements, and I now give the floor to the representative of Hungary.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, we thank Malta for their leadership in organizing this crucial debate, as well as the briefers for their sobering but much needed insights. Hungary is appalled by the systematic use of sexual violence by state and non-state actors as a tactic of war, torture, and terrorism in armed conflicts, and that the proliferation of arms and the illicit trafficking of weapons increases the use of sexual violence and threatens women's and girls' safety and empowerment in post-conflict settings. We call on all parties to respect international law, to prevent and end all form of violence and abuse, including conflict-related sexual violence. We are strongly committed to strengthening international cooperation aimed at first preventing CRSV, secondly, supporting survivors and holding perpetrators accountable, and thirdly, addressing root causes of sexual violence. First, in order to strengthen prevention, we call for a gender-responsive and effective arms control and disarmament policies. We call for listing CRSV as a criterion in sanctions regimes and sanctioning those responsible for CRSV, and also for taking into account in arms export assessments the risk of the arms being used to commit CRSV, as well as for incorporating a gender perspective in early warning systems, conflict prevention, and management efforts. Second, in order to support survivors, we call for holistic, comprehensive, survivor-centered, and trauma-informed support and services, including healthcare and legal services, mental health, psychological, and long-term socio-economic support. We call for access to justice and remedies, and also for adequate support to civil society organizations providing services to survivors, as well as for accountability for the perpetrators. Third, long-term prevention is only possible through addressing the root causes of gender inequality and through ensuring women's full, equal, meaningful, safe, and institutionalized participation at all levels of decision-making, including those related to arms control, disarmament, demobilization, reintegration, and post-conflict peace-building efforts, as well as in the design, implementation, and evaluation of related policies. Only the empowerment of all women and girls and their full agency in public life, in the economy, and in society can bring justice and lasting peace. Mr. President, the urgency of preventing and ending conflict-related sexual violence is underlined in the most dreadful way by the horrific crimes committed by Hamas against women, children, and other civilians during and since its October 7th attack in Israel. The most egregious forms of violence have also been committed against the hostages, one of whom is a Hungarian national, and this violence may still be ongoing. We thank SRSG Patten for her report, published on March 4th, documenting the evidence of conflict-related sexual violence. These atrocities are inconceivable and unacceptable, and we condemn them in the most serious manner. We join the SRSG's call in her report in urging Hamas and other armed groups to immediately and unconditionally release all hostages and to ensure their protection, including from sexual violence. We call for the investigation and prosecution of all crimes related to CRSV. Mr. President, we must ensure that such a terrorist attack can never happen anywhere in the world again. We must do our utmost to prevent escalation of conflicts, and we must protect civilians in line with international law, including from conflict-related sexual violence. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Hungary for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Morocco.
Je vous remercie.
Thank you, Mr. President. I wish to take this opportunity first and foremost to thank you for the convening of this debate on an issue of utmost importance, namely the prevention of conflict-related sexual violence. I wish to thank the Special Representative of the Secretary General for her presence among us and for her participation in today's debate. President, over the course of the past decade, the international community has progressively grown more and more aware of the gravity and the magnitude of sexual violence in armed conflict and the devastating impact on victims, communities, and regional and international security. In this regard, it adopted important measures to counter these heinous crimes, calling for their prevention and punishment and for the promotion of peace, justice, and gender equality. The historic resolution, Security Council Resolution 1325, and subsequent resolutions complement existing international instruments, thereby providing a robust legal arsenal and ensuring that there be protection for women and girls in conflict situations and the promotion of gender equality in all conflicts for conflict resolution, peace building, reconstruction, and post-conflict development. Resolution 2467, dating 2019, emphasizes in particular that the illicit transfer, destabilizing accumulation, and misuse of SALW fuel armed conflicts and have a wide range of negative human rights, humanitarian development, and socioeconomic consequences, in particular on the security of civilians in armed conflict, including the disproportionate impact on violence perpetrated against women and girls and exacerbating sexual and gender-based violence in conflict. In Agenda 2030 for Sustainable Development, there is an emphasis on the cross-cutting incorporation of the gender dimension in all SDGs, and this reflects that gender, peace, and security and development are linked, interconnected, and inextricably entwined. Morocco also welcomes the sustained attention by the Secretary General to international peace and security by presenting a novel peace agenda with the goal of incorporating the initiatives in the international community in a collective approach that is more proactive and coherent for more effective and efficient results. Morocco appreciates that the new agenda for peace places the question of gender equality at the heart of the international community's concerns. Moreover, despite the progress that has been achieved, it is evident that sexual violence in conflict persists, unfortunately. The occurrence of these crimes is becoming a source of great concern. In light of these challenges, there's a crucial need to redouble efforts to counter the heinous crimes of sexual violence in armed conflict, specifically through the adoption of a holistic approach, specifically focusing on the following areas. Number one, promotion of a culture of respect for human rights and gender equality, which advocates the incorporation of protection of women and girls in all security policies, peacekeeping, and sustainable development and transitional justice efforts. Two, supporting initiatives for peace building which tackle root cause of conflict, that promote development, gender equality, and empowerment of women. The role and contribution of the CSW are critical in this regard. Three, ensuring accountability for perpetrators of sexual violence. Four, encouraging efforts of disarmament and non-proliferation with a gender perspective, with a sine qua non the establishment of safe, secure environments for women and girls. This is critical for prevention of conflict-related sexual violence. 5, incorporating the gender perspective and enhancing the participation of women in political and decision-making processes, as well as international efforts for nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation. 6, stepping up international cooperation and regional cooperation in capacity building to train women in the areas of preventive diplomacy, mediation, peacekeeping, and prevention of violent extremism. The Kingdom of Morocco is a member of the Group of Friends for the Women, Peace and Security Agenda and the Group of Friends for Gender Equality. We are signatory of almost all international human rights protection instruments, including soft law, and we fully embrace international commitments to counter all forms of sexual violence, including during conflict. Morocco adopted and implemented the Women, Peace and Security Plan of Action. We remain engaged with the international community to ensure the implementation of the Women, Peace and Security Agenda to end CRSV and to ensure the well-being of all women and girls throughout the world. Thank you.
Representative of Morocco for their statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Austria.
Thank you, Mr. President. Austria aligns itself with the statements made on behalf of the EU and the Group of Friends on Women, Peace and Security. We commend Malta for organizing the annual debate and thank SRSG Patten for her tireless work. Let me also thank the briefers for sharing their perspectives. This is a crucial moment, and our debate is more relevant than ever. Brutal aggressions and armed conflicts have devastating impacts on people all around the world, but the gendered impact of increased violence is undeniable. Sexual violence is one of the most cruel tactics to inflict harm and suffering on human beings. Austria strongly condemns all forms of CRSV wherever they occur, which not only violate human rights and humanitarian law, but often result in severe, lifelong impacts, both mentally and physically. Estimations from UNIDIR show that between 70 to 90% of all incidents of conflict-related sexual violence involve weapons and firearms, strongly linking the efforts to prevent sexual violence with the need for disarmament, demilitarization, and arms control as critical tools. On today's discussion, both the Women, Peace and Security Agenda and disarmament are two key priorities in Austria's foreign policy. Each year, Austria publishes a comprehensive report to assess the national implementation of Resolution 1325 of this Council. Let me address two matters of particular concern for Austria. First, the group of survivors of CRSV is not a homogeneous group, but consists of persons of all ages, with different ethnicities, backgrounds, with or without disabilities, with diverse gender identities and sexual orientations. Despite their variety, their cases share one common factor: impunity for these crimes is the sad norm. Mr. President, let me be clear on this. Perpetrators of sexual violence must be held accountable. CRSV does not end with the end of a conflict for survivors. Neither should our efforts. Austria therefore commends the UN team of experts on the rule of law and sexual violence in conflict for its commitment and determination to fight impunity for sexual violence in conflict and post-conflict contexts. It is and remains the only Security Council mandated mechanism to work side by side with member states to address these conflict-related sexual violence crimes using domestic justice systems. That is why Austria financially contributes to the YON team of experts to build the capacity of member states to investigate and prosecute conflict-related sexual violence crimes. Secondly, it is a fact that women, men, girls, and boys are differently impacted by armed conflict and by specific weapons. Weapons do not deter violence. They're an instrument to inflict violence at a different scale. A gender-responsive perspective to disarmament therefore encompasses to properly taking into account gender-based violence to effectively prevent human suffering. Austria has and continues to address the humanitarian consequences of weapons, from weapons of mass destruction to small arms and light weapons, and most recently, lethal autonomous weapon systems. The WPS agenda provides a particular approach in this regard. Mr. President, allow me to close my statement by echoing the SRSG's recommendation to the Security Council issued in her report, to call upon all parties to conflict to immediately cease all forms of conflict-related sexual violence in compliance with relevant Security Council resolutions and provide the United Nations with unhindered access to conflict areas and detention centers. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Austria for their statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Thailand.
Mr. President, at the outset, Thailand thanks Malta for organizing this open debate on the important topic of women, peace, and security. We also appreciate all the briefers for their insights. Thailand unequivocally condemns sexual violence, both in times of conflict and in times of peace, as well as its use as weapons of war. Thailand believes that the protection of civilians must be a priority. We call on the international community and all parties involved in conflicts to do their utmost to implement the relevant UNSC resolutions to ensure the protection of civilians. Despite the groundbreaking UNSC Resolution 1820/2008, demanding the immediate and complete cessation of all acts of sexual violence against civilians in armed conflicts, reports by the Secretary General have confirmed the persistence of conflict-related sexual violence. Thailand shares our deep concerns with other member states regarding this ongoing atrocity. According to the United Nations Institute for Disarmament Research, 70 to 90% of CRSV involves weapons and firearms. Demilitarization and gender-responsive arms control are, therefore, key measures to reduce and eradicate sexual violence in conflict situations. Thailand has supported gender mainstreaming in multilateral frameworks on arms control and disarmament, including the UN POA on small arms and light weapons and global framework on ammunition management. This is important to the realization of UNSC Resolution 1325/2000 on women, peace, and security. To contribute to today's debate, Thailand wishes to highlight the following 4 Ps. First, prevention. By addressing sexual violence at its root causes, this involves the protection and promotion of women's rights, the empowerment of women, and the advancement of gender equality. Efforts must be aimed at reducing pre-existing structural inequalities, eradicating all forms of discrimination, and combating extreme poverty amongst women and girls. Second, protection. Through strengthening justice and accountability and adopting a survivor-centered approach in the prevention and response to CRSV, in line with the UNSC Resolution 2467/2019. The rights of women and girls, particularly survivors of CRSV, must be protected and guaranteed, including through ensuring better access to services and justice, reducing marginalization and stigmatization, and enabling effective investigation and prosecution of sexual violence crimes as well as human rights violation. Third, participation. By considering women as active agents of change, women's full, equal, and meaningful participation must be promoted at all levels and throughout the peace continuum. Thailand, therefore, echoes the call for an increase in women's leadership and influence in decision-making related to arms control and disarmament. Thailand supports the efforts to increase the deployment of women peacekeepers in line with the Uniform Gender Parity Strategy 2018 to 2028
and to strengthen the protection of women peace builders. Moreover, we reaffirm our support for the deployment of women's protection advisors in all UN peacekeeping operations and special political missions to ensure that women's needs are fulfilled and that the issue of sexual violence be properly addressed. Fourth, partnerships. With the conviction that member states can benefit from exchanges of information and best practices regarding CRSV and gender-responsive arms control. In this regard, Thailand encourages the strengthening of partnerships among member states, UN agencies, and regional organizations to provide technical support and capacity building. Mr. President, in conclusion, sexual violence against any individual is unjustifiable and wrong. We must unite and do our utmost to eliminate sexual violence in all forms and in instances, including in conflict-related situations. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Thailand for their statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Italy.
Mr. President, first of all, I wish to acknowledge Malta in its role as President of the Security Council for April 2024 for fostering dialogue on today's critical issues. Italy and myself, with the statement by the European Union and in its national capacity, would like to add the following. Italy has consistently championed women's rights and security, particularly within the context of armed conflict, where gender-based violence causes immeasurable suffering and perpetuates cycles of instability. It's paramount to protect women and girls and to hold perpetrators of crimes accountable. In this regard, we firmly reject any act of sexual violence committed in conflict situations, wherever this may occur and whoever the perpetrator is. In this way, we condemn in the strongest terms possible the sexual and gender-based violence perpetrated by Hamas on October the 7th and afterwards. Italy engages actively in many multi-sectoral initiatives aimed at safeguarding women's rights and ensuring their security. In this regard, we have long been staunch supporters of the Women, Peace and Security Agenda and of the resolution of the General Assembly and of the Human Rights Council addressing violence against women and girls in conflict zones. We have consistently advocated for the implementation of these resolutions and have actively contributed to shaping global policies and initiatives in this regard. In particular, Italy advocates for arms control and disarmament as a means to reduce violence against women. The correlation between arms proliferation and gender-based violence is evident, in particular with regard to small arms and light weapons. When weapons flow freely, conflict zones become more dangerous. Women and girls often bear the brunt of this violence, whether as direct targets or collateral damage. By promoting disarmament, we create safer environments for women. To this end, we work closely with the United Nations and its agencies in the firm belief that multilateral cooperation and collective action are key to addressing the root causes of armed conflict and to achieving sustainable peace for women across the world. Our yearly financial contributions to the United Nations team of experts on the rule of law and sexual violence in conflict demonstrate our earnest commitment to building a culture of accountability, to guaranteeing justice for every survivor, and to implementing preventive measures in conflict-prone regions. As we mark the 15th anniversary of Security Council Resolution 1888, we encourage other nations to join us in supporting this fund. Only together we can dismantle the structures that perpetuate violence and build a world where women live without fear. By protecting women and advocating for arms control and disarmament, we take meaningful steps toward a safer and more equitable future for all of us all. Thank you very much.
I thank the representative of Italy for their statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Czechia.
Well, thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, according to the Secretary General's report, civilians around the world were at greater risk of conflict-related sexual violence last year due to the proliferation of weapons and increased militarization. Impunity for this type of violence, which targets mainly women and girls, remains the norm. This is alarming. The main perpetrators of these despicable acts have been armed actors. The widespread availability and trafficking of weapons such as small arms and light weapons continue to enable sexual violence, especially in conflict and post-conflict areas like the Democratic Republic of Congo, Sudan, South Sudan, and Myanmar. Rape continues to be used as a tactic of war and terrorism, as demonstrated by Hamas during the 7th of October attack on Israel. Czechia strongly condemns such crimes and calls upon all parties to immediately end all forms of conflict-related sexual violence. We urge the Security Council to use all the tools at its disposal to prevent and respond to gender-based violence, and to take comprehensive and gender-sensitive action on disarmament, non-proliferation, and arms export control. Member States must fulfill their obligations in this regard and halt arms transfers that may lead to the perpetuation of sexual violence. Czechia fully applies the relevant provisions of the Arms Trade Treaty with regard to the assessment of relevant risks, including gender-based violence and the gender dimension of small arms and light weapons exports and proliferation. Mr. President, different multilateral frameworks can be leveraged to integrate gender perspectives into disarmament, non-proliferation, and arms export control, and to strengthen the prevention of and response to conflict-related sexual violence. Systematic collection and analysis of data regarding these incidents and the role of weapons are key to the development of effective prevention strategies. We fully support the work of the UN in the area of monitoring and verification. Czechia will also continue to work with the international community to fight against impunity of the perpetrators, and we will support survivors of conflict-related sexual violence. The role of civil society organizations in this regard is invaluable. We will also continue to provide assistance to Ukrainian survivors of these crimes committed in the context of Russia's aggression against Ukraine. Although women and girls suffer disproportionately from conflict-related sexual violence, their voices are still underrepresented in decision-making on matters of peace and security. Czechia remains committed to advancing gender equality and ensuring the full, equal, and meaningful participation of women and girls in all areas of peace and security, in line with the Security Council resolutions. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Czechia for their statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Croatia.
Mr. President, I thank Malta for convening this debate and the distinguished briefers for sharing their valuable insights, including survivors' perspective. Croatia aligns itself with the statements of the European Union and Group of Friends of Women, Peace and Security, and I would like to add some remarks in my national capacity. When referring to women's rights, the new Agenda for Peace rightfully calls for dismantling oppressive patriarchal power structures that stand in the way of women's full, equal and meaningful participation in political and public life. Only through elimination of discrimination and violence against women and their empowerment in times of peace can we prevent sexual violence against them in times of war. Today's discussion is an opportunity to examine the ways in which arms control and disarmament can help prevent conflict-related sexual violence. The Secretary-General's reports confirm the link between arms proliferation and sexual and gender-based violence. In our view, it applies both to conflict and non-conflict settings. This is an additional reason why Member States must give high priority to robust arms regulation. Along with all undertaken arms control and disarmament commitments, aligning national action plans on women, peace and security and small arms control is the most effective approach to reduce violence, build peace and strengthen national gender-responsive frameworks. To achieve better synergy between disarmament frameworks and women, peace and security, we need greater representation of women in multilateral dialogues on non-proliferation and disarmament, in peace talks and conflict prevention. Disarmament is particularly relevant in post-conflict settings where peace-building commission can play an important role in preventing conflict and sustaining peace, including through the light footprint missions that could be deployed to assist transition from peacekeeping to peace-building. They can help prevent fragile countries from sliding into conflict and thus protect women and girls from further violence. This also includes supporting survivors, civil society and women's organizations, especially at the local level. Their role is critical in advocating disarmament and arms control as the basis for peace, long-term development and gender justice. I thank you.
Thank the representative of Croatia for their statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Denmark.
Mr. President, Excellencies, distinguished delegates, I am delivering this statement on behalf of the Nordic countries, Finland, Iceland, Norway, Sweden, and my own country, Denmark. Thank you, first and foremost, to our distinguished briefers for their sobering statements and their important work in this field. This past year was marked by new outbreaks and escalations of conflicts, exposing civilians to heightened levels of sexual and gender-based violence. This trend is fueled by arms proliferation, militarization among state and non-state actors. Women and girls, in all their diversity, continue to be disproportionately affected by conflict-related sexual violence, not least due to patterns of multiple and intersecting forms of discrimination and gender inequality predating the conflicts. Men, boys, and LGBTI persons are also affected. The full extent of conflict-related sexual violence on a global scale remains unknown, as fear of reprisals and stigma act as long-standing and persistent barriers for survivors to come forward. The Nordic countries express our grave concern at the severity and brutality of the cases recorded throughout 2023. The historical record which the Secretary General's report represents is a testament to the daunting fact that sexual violence continues to play a significant role in the fabric of war. Approximately 70 to 90% of incidents of conflict-related sexual violence involve small arms and light weapons. We therefore welcome the focus on the role of demilitarization and gender-responsive arms control in addressing conflict-related sexual violence. We want to highlight 4 points in this regard. First, the Nordics support and reaffirm the importance of accelerated and timely deployment of gender advisors and women's protection advisors to peace operations, including those undergoing transitions and phased drawdowns. In the context of UN mission withdrawals and reconfigurations, it is critical to retain gender expertise in shifting constellations of UN presence. It is equally important to ensure gender-responsive security and justice sector reform, arms control, and disarmament provisions in mandate authorizations and renewals. Second point, the Nordics stress the need to empower women and ensure their free, equal, and meaningful participation in disarmament, security sector reform, and arms control decision-making processes. These efforts must be grounded in an understanding of the full spectrum of security risks women face, not only when they are directly affected by conflict, but also when they are active in public life, for example, as human rights defenders, lawyers, journalists, or peace builders. Thirdly, as we mark the 15-year anniversary of Security Council Resolution 1888, we note the important work of the UN team of experts on the rule of law and sexual violence in conflict. This remains the only Security Council mandated mechanism to work side by side with member states to address these heinous crimes using domestic justice systems. We encourage fellow member states to make use of this important tool and to consider supporting its work through voluntary contributions. Fourth point, The Nordic countries support efforts to include sexual and gender-based violence as a standalone designation criterion for targeted sanctions, and strengthen expertise on conflict-related sexual violence within sanctioned committees, as well as to list persistent perpetrators of conflict-related sexual violence crimes. We have the tools at our disposal. It is now time to utilize them. Mr. President, if we are to ensure that commitments on paper turn into concrete change in the lives of survivors on the ground, then we must use every tool available to eliminate conflict-related sexual violence whilst addressing its root causes. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Denmark for their statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Albania.
Thank you, Mr. President. At the outset, I would like to thank the Maltese presidency for organizing this open debate. I would also like to express our gratitude to the briefers whose presentation helped us to better understand the realities on the ground. I also thank the Special Representative, Ms. Pramila Patten, for her action and commitment. We reiterate our full support for the mandate of the Special Rapporteur. Mr. President, the Secretary General's annual report on sexual violence in conflict is a dispiriting read. Sexual violence continues to be used as a weapon of war and terror to punish civilians and terrorize communities. In Ukraine, reports of women, girls, and children raped by the Russian aggressors remain a painful and appealing testimony of the usage of sexual violence as a weapon of war and its destructive force in the society. In Sudan, South Sudan, Mali, Central African Republic, Democratic Republic of Congo, Afghanistan, Myanmar, Somalia, Syria, Libya, and Yemen, women continue to be objects of different forms of sexual violence. Albania strongly condemns the use of sexual violence as a weapon of terror by Hamas during the attack of 7th of October. Mr. President, one of the key factors contributing to conflict-related sexual violence is the presence of weapons and militarized environments. In conflict zones, arms proliferation and militarization create an atmosphere of fear and insecurity, making individuals, and particularly women and marginalized groups, vulnerable to sexual violence and exploitation. Therefore, it is essential to focus on demilitarization and gender-responsive arm controls as strategy for preventing conflict-related sexual violence. In this context, I would like to focus on 3 points. First, we must promote gender equality and improve the meaningful participation of women in disarmament, leadership positions, non-proliferation and armed controls forums. Women involvement and effective participation in disarmament and non-proliferation-related decision-making processes can only help in implementing a gender-responsive approach in disarmament and armed conflict efforts. Second, United Nations Security Council and regional bodies should do more to leverage disarmament frameworks, UN mechanisms and tools. We must make sure that disarmament process and mechanism address the root causes of violence and include provisions to prevent and address CRSV. The upcoming 4th Review Conference on the UN Plan of Action provides an opportunity to strengthen commitments to prevent and address CRSV through disarmament frameworks. Third, member states should reduce the risk that arms transfer and illicit weapons are used to commit CRSV by strengthening national regulations on arms transfers and weapons control. This can be achieved by supporting the implementation of international arms control agreements and mechanisms, such as the Arms Trade Treaty, as well as promoting transparency and accountability in arms transfer. Mr. President, conflict-related sexual violence has a dehumanized nature. It doesn't just harm a single individual or a single family, or even a single group. It negatively affects and endangers families and communities, erodes social and political stability, and undermines economic progress and reconciliation. Coming from a region which, in the not-so-distant past, has been the showplace of major conflict, we have witnessed how sexual violence has been used as a tactic of war against civilians. No later than yesterday, 2 of the survivors of sexual violence from the last war in Kosovo have been seated in this room, and their story has been shared by the President of Kosovo, a story not only of despair, but a story of courage and advocacy for amplifying the voices of wartime sexual violence survivors in Kosovo and everywhere. The Republic of Kosovo has turned today into a positive example on identifying, documenting, and addressing the cases of conflict-related sexual violence, especially regarding the redress and reparations of the survivors of the physical, psychological, economic, and social trauma they have endured during the war. The world can learn a lot from Kosovo in that regard. We strongly believe that positive examples like the Republic of Kosovo should be reflected in the annual report of the SG on CRSV. This would contribute to a wider understanding on the situation of survivors in the region, and it would help to monitor and document on an annual basis the progress made. Mr. President, the voices of more than 20,000 abused women and girls of the conflict in Kosovo must be heard, as must be heard all the voices of all women and girls around the world. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Albania for their statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Poland.
Mr. President, we thank Malta for convening this important debate and express gratitude to Special Representative and all other briefers for their valuable insights. Poland is deeply concerned with the situation in a significant number of countries where conflict-related sexual violence is committed both by state and non-state actors. Saying so, Poland aligns itself with the statement by the European Union and the group of friends of women, peace and security. Poland appreciates the Secretary General's recent informative report, which offers thorough analysis and practical recommendations on the CRSV prevention. Sexual violence is used as a tool of warfare employed to destroy societies through humiliation, stigmatization, death, HIV infection, and to alter ethnic demographics. While women, girls, and vulnerable groups among civilians are disproportionately affected, we must remember that the male victims also suffer. Poland stands in solidarity with all victims of sexual violence in conflict and calls for a greater support and empowerment for them. Mr. President, we also emphasize the need for women's full, equal, and meaningful participation in all processes related to ending sexual violences in conflict, including peace negotiations and the mediation efforts, as well as in arms control. They must be involved in all levels of decision-making and implementation of such efforts. Poland also endorses the further deployment of women's protection advisors and a broader use of early warning indicators of conflict-related sexual violence. As a neighbor hosting a significant group of war refugees, Poland is appalled by the conflict-related sexual violence perpetrated in Ukraine by Russian soldiers against civilians and prisoners of war. Given that this year's report clearly states that the Russian armed forces and the law enforcement agencies committed numerous cases of conflict-related sexual violence against Ukrainian civilians and prisoners of war, and that these acts have been both widespread, deliberate, and systematic, we deeply regret that they have not been listed in the annex to the report among parties being responsible for rape or other forms of sexual violence in situations of armed conflicts where they clearly belong. The risk of sexual violence is compounded by the mass displacement that the Russian aggression has caused, exposing vulnerable groups to trafficking. Armed conflicts activate criminal groups seeking quick profit by taking advantage of the dramatic situation of the people fleeing military aggression and humanitarian crises. Poland has taken steps to prevent trafficking among Ukrainian refugees and support survivors of sexual violence through intensive therapy pilot program for trauma treatment. Mr. President, we support efforts to hold perpetrators of war crimes accountable. Poland assists the ICC's efforts to collect and preserve evidence of Russia's war crimes committed in Ukraine. To this end, together with Lithuania and Ukraine, and in cooperation with the International Criminal Court in The Hague, we have established a joint investigation team. Membership of 4 additional countries, Estonia, Latvia, Slovakia, and Romania, the participation of the ICC and the Europol, and as well as the Memorandum of Understanding signed by the United States, all confirm that no effort will be spared in gathering evidence and bringing those responsible to account. In conclusion, let me reiterate that Poland condemns the use of conflict-related sexual violence and calls for strengthened prevention efforts, accountability measures, and justice. And I thank you.
I thank the representative of Poland for their statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Ukraine.
Well, thank you, Mr. President. I thank the Malta presidency for organizing this important debate And I also thank the Special Representative Pramila Patten for your insightful briefing. I'm also grateful to briefers for sharing their testimonies and practical recommendations with us today. My delegation aligns itself with the statements by the European Union and the one on behalf of the group of friends of women, peace and security. And I would like to highlight a few points in my national capacity. The report depicts a grim reality in 2023. The outbreak and escalation of conflict exposed civilians to increased levels of conflict-related sexual violence, intentionally used to terrorize communities and dismantle the social fabric. These despicable crimes inflict lasting trauma on survivors and their families. Russia weaponizes sexual violence amidst its war of aggression against Ukraine and supports other CRSV perpetrators in various conflict situations. The report presented highlights the reprehensible tactics employed by the Russian aggressors in Ukraine, using sexual violence as a weapon and tool of torture against civilians and prisoners of war. These atrocities were also starkly outlined in the reports of the Independent Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine and the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. Testimonies from individuals released from Russian captivity reveal that over 50% of detainees endured torture, rape, or other forms of sexualized ill treatment. To underscore the urgency and gravity of the situation, the Permanent Mission of Ukraine, in collaboration with Canada, Liechtenstein, Colombia, and the All Survivors Project, convened a thematic event today. As of now, Ukrainian prosecutors have documented 290 cases of CRSV affecting 102 men and 188 women, including 15 minors. These cases involve various abuses such as rape, genital violence, forced nudity, threats, attempted rape, and witnessing the sexual abuse of family members, among others. However, these figures represent only the tip of the iceberg due to under-reporting and limited access to occupied territories. We firmly believe that the Russian army and Russian law enforcement agencies such as the FSB belong on a list as parties to the conflict reliably suspected of committing acts of rape and other forms of sexual violence. We echo the call of the Security Council to utilize all available means to prevent and address various manifestations of sexual and gender-based violence, including CRSV. We also call on member states to fulfill their disarmament and arms control obligations and place gender lenses at the heart of such policies. Mr. President, Ukraine is resolute in its commitment to ensure accountability for these heinous crimes and to providing all necessary assistance to survivors. We appreciate the international community's support, which amplifies our resolve. Ukraine is proud to co-chair the International Alliance on Preventing Sexual Violence in Conflict initiative that was launched by the United Kingdom. We appreciate the efforts of SRSG, Ms. Patten and her team for substantial assistance to the government of Ukraine in achieving these goals. The framework of cooperation with the United Nations to respond to and prevent CRSV, signed in May 2022, helped to establish the national all-encompassing coordination mechanism for combating CRSV. Today, a detailed implementation plan involving state institutions, civil society, and international organizations is being implemented. As a part of it, in partnership with UNFPA, we opened 12 stationed and 3 mobile survivor relief centers to operate across the country, providing various services. Together with Global Survivors Fund, the government of Ukraine has launched a pilot project on urgent interim reparation for CRSV survivors in Ukraine. Survivors cannot wait until the war is over. They need support and justice now. To conclude, our message is clear. Sexual violence in conflict will not be tolerated, and those who commit such crimes will be prosecuted and held accountable. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Ukraine for their statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Colombia.
Gracias. Thank you, President. Global priorities seem to have been reversed. As said by the Special Representative, excessive use of resources in the defence sector perpetuates violence and distracts our efforts from protecting and guaranteeing human rights. In turn, this moves us further away from the possibility of creating better and more capacities to combat the multiple and intersectional forms of discrimination, as well as inequalities and other global challenges which affect the lives of human beings throughout the world. The Security Council has the authority to insist upon the establishment and implementation of national measures and the implementation of the existing instruments and mechanisms on disarmament, as well as the instruments on non-proliferation and arms control, particularly including those which recognize the nexus between firearms, ammunition, and gender-based violence and sexual violence. Amongst the measures which Colombia deems to be fundamental to counter this kind of violence, the full, equal and significant participation and effective participation of women in decision-making and in the implementation of international instruments on disarmament would contribute to creating more robust solutions, as well as bearing in mind the differentiated effect that arms have on women and other vulnerable social groups. My delegation deems it necessary to focus on the systematic understanding of the widespread aspect of violence caused by weapons and firearms, so as to be able to create specific policies to tackle this area. This includes developing risk assessments about risks linked to gender violence, as well as carrying out investigations and compiling statistical data, which is gender sensitive. Excellencies, Colombia recognizes the value of the Security Council seeking strategies actively so as to achieve synergies between the various mechanisms, programs, and instruments in the field of disarmament, non-proliferation, and arms control, with those linked to the decrease and prevention of gender-based violence. It's indispensable to promote initiatives tending to increase the participation of women and the LGBTIQ+ community in multilateral disarmament scenarios, particularly those at a high level. In turn, it's also important to promote the inclusion of a gender perspective into national disarmament plans, like the one that Colombia is drawing up in the context of our total peace law, and at all stages of peace processes and peacekeeping actions. Such efforts must be carried out simultaneously with measures which promote full access to justice, reparation, truth, and recognition of the needs of victims and survivors. Protection of and guarantee of full enjoyment of human rights for all persons must always be at the heart. I thank you.
Thank the representative of Colombia for their statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Bulgaria.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, Bulgaria aligns itself with the statements made on behalf of the European Union and the Group of Friends of Women, Peace and Security. I will add a few points in my national capacity. I would like to thank Malta for organizing this debate on such a pertinent topic, and special thanks to the briefers for their insightful and sobering remarks. Bulgaria welcomes this debate's focus on preventing conflict-related sexual violence through demilitarization and gender-responsive arms control. We reaffirm our commitment to the guiding principles of Resolution 1325 and all subsequent resolutions aimed at the protection of women and girls from the scourge of gender-based violence in conflict zones. The findings in the Secretary General Annual Report are extremely alarming. Bulgaria strongly condemns all acts of sexual violence. They are unacceptable and cannot be tolerated under any circumstances. As we reflect on the evolving landscape of armed conflict and its intersection with gender-based violence, Bulgaria underscores the imperative to address the root causes of conflict-related sexual violence. As mentioned by SRSG Patten, between 70 and 90% of conflict-related sexual violence incidents involve the use of a weapon, in particular firearms. Yet another proof that proliferation of arms and illicit trafficking of weapons exacerbate the use of sexual violence by armed groups, organized crime, and terrorist entities. This not only perpetuates cycles of violence, but also undermines peace-building efforts and violates fundamental human rights. Bulgaria emphasizes the need for robust and effective arms regulation aligned with gender-responsive approaches to prevent the use of conflict-related sexual violence. The Arms Trade Treaty and the Programme of Action on Combating the Illicit Trade in Small Arms and Light Weapons in all its aspects can play a significant role in diminishing the proliferation of arms and assessing the risk of arms exports contributing to gender-based violence. Furthermore, Bulgaria applauds the recent adoption of the 2023 Global Framework for Through-Life conventional ammunition management, which emphasizes mainstreaming a gender perspective in related policies and practices. We would like to underscore the importance of the full and meaningful participation of women in arms control and disarmament fora as outlined in Security Council Resolutions 2122 and 2242. In addressing conflict-related sexual violence in peace processes and operations, Bulgaria advocates for the deployment of gender advisors and women protection advisors as specified in relevant Security Council resolutions. We emphasize the need to engage with women and women-led organizations in disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration efforts, ensuring their access to resources and protection mechanisms. Mr. President, Bulgaria emphasizes the importance of cross-leveraging disarmament frameworks and UN mechanisms to enhance conflict-related sexual violence prevention. We stress the need to sustain security sector reform and disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration investments during transitions to prevent the recurrence of violence. I would also like to express my support for the side event today organized by Canada, Liechtenstein, and Ukraine, which aimed to shed light on the often overlooked issue of conflict-related sexual violence against men and boys, particularly in detention settings, with the objective of raising awareness, improving responses, and ensuring survivor-centered approaches to address their specific needs. In conclusion, Bulgaria reaffirms its commitment to advancing the Women, Peace and Security agenda and stands ready to collaborate with all relevant stakeholders to prevent conflict-related sexual violence and promote sustainable peace and security. We believe that these considerations should also be borne in mind in working on the upcoming Summit of the Future and the 2025 review of the United Nations peace-building architecture. Allow me to add with a quote by Ralph Waldo Emerson, who said that peace cannot be achieved through violence, but can only be attained through understanding. Let us work together and really look forward for more understanding. We need it. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Bulgaria for their statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Liechtenstein.
Thank you, Mr. President. We thank Malta for convening this timely debate on demilitarization and gender-responsive arms control. In spite and because of the record number of armed conflicts since World War II, as well as the record global military spending, we must reimagine a world of peace. The United Nations, which at its very heart is a peace organization, has prioritized disarmament efforts since its inception.
the full and effective implementation of milestone documents such as the Programme of Action to Prevent, Combat and Eradicate the Illicit Trade in Small Arms and Light Weapons in all its aspects and the Arms Trade Treaty will be key to a more peaceful world. We are particularly concerned by the large number of civilian casualties, including women and girls, and the increased use of explosive weapons in urbanized areas, and call upon all states that have not yet done so to sign the political declaration on strengthening the protection of civilians from the humanitarian consequences arising from the use of explosive weapons in populated areas. The use of small arms and light weapons by non-state actors, such as in Haiti, is of particular concern as well, and we call for the effective implementation of Security Council Resolution 2699 on the prohibition of the supply, sale and transfer of such weapons to Haiti. Mr. President, sexual violence continues to be a crime committed in virtually all armed conflicts with various scopes and links to policies. While women and girls are disproportionately targeted in certain circumstances, such as prison settings, men and boys even make up the majority of victims. We are deeply concerned about reports of widespread and systematic use of sexual violence against Ukrainian prisoners of war by Russian authorities, and thank the All Survivors Project for its important work in this regard, including today's side event on the topic. We are alarmed by the many credible reports of rape and gang rape since the outbreak of the armed conflict in Sudan over a year ago, underscoring the immense suffering of the civilian population at the hands of the two rival factions. Following the latest report of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, many of these incidents may amount to war crimes. And we are also alarmed by the findings of the report by the Special Representative of the Secretary General on Sexual Violence in Conflict on sexual violence committed on October 7th and its aftermath. All reported incidences of conflict-related sexual violence must be vigorously investigated and prosecuted, including by the International Criminal Court. Mr. President, structural discrimination against women and girls and their systematic persecution simply because of their gender in some parts of this world, such as in Afghanistan, remains unacceptable and violates international law. We call upon this Council to monitor the situation in Afghanistan carefully and hope for a speedy appointment of the Special Envoy by the Secretary General to support the implementation of the independent assessment's recommendation, with a view to protect the human rights and fundamental freedoms of all. We also condemn the ongoing gender persecution by Iranian authorities and the violent repression of the peaceful women life freedom movement, including through the weaponization of rape and other forms of sexual violence against both female and male protesters. Impunity for these crimes under international law must end. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Liechtenstein for their statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Germany.
Mr. President, Excellencies, Germany aligns itself with the statements on behalf of the European Union, on behalf of the Group of Friends of Women, Peace and Security, and the LGBTI core group. In the face of numerous wars and geopolitical divergences, we are living in a world where armed conflict is on the rise. We globally witness an enormous increase in military spending, and we are confronted with an erosion of arms control regimes. The implication is clear. With more wars and less arms control regimes comes an increase in arms proliferation and more risk of conflict-related sexual violence. Member states must therefore fulfill disarmament obligations by which they are bound, establish effective arms and ammunition control regimes, and take into account the risks of gender-based violence in arms export assessments as a means of prevention of CRSV. It is particularly necessary to take account of the differential impact of the illicit trade in small arms and light weapons on women, men, girls, and boys, and to strengthen or develop, where they do not exist, response mechanisms to address such impacts. In our view, the review conference of the UN Programme of Action to Prevent, Combat and Eradicate the Illicit Trade in Small Arms and Light Weapons in all its aspects will play a crucial role in that regard. While prevention is key, as long as CRSV is such a widespread scourge, we must also address the rampant crisis of impunity and ensure accountability of perpetrators. Exactly 5 years ago today, on the 23rd of April 2019, UN Security Council Resolution 2467 was passed. By initiating this resolution, Germany put special emphasis on holding the perpetrators of sexual violence accountable and putting survivors' needs center stage. The normative framework established by the Security Council and international law is clear. Perpetrators of conflict-related sexual violence must be held to account with due process of law, and survivors of these crimes deserve justice in a trauma-informed manner that puts their rights and needs at the center. Tragically, the reality by far too often shows a different picture. We do not have a deficit in the definition of legal standards, but a deficit in action and implementation that we urgently need to address. That is why Germany is staunchly supporting the United Nations team of experts on the rule of law and sexual violence in conflict in order to build the capacity of member states to investigate and prosecute conflict-related sexual violence crimes. As has been pointed out by numerous delegations before us, the team of experts under the strategic direction of Special Representative Patten is and remains the only Security Council mandated mechanism to work side by side with member states to address these conflict-related sexual violence crimes using domestic justice systems. Germany calls on fellow member states to support the team's work and to scale up its resources to ensure that we meet our commitments, to guarantee that every member state that so requests has the ability to address conflict-related sexual violence in a holistic manner and every survivor receives justice that she or he rightly deserves. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Germany for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Australia.
Thank you, President. Australia thanks Malta for convening today's open debate on this important issue, and we thank today's briefers as well. As another year passes, we continue to be appalled by the perpetration of sexual violence in conflict and the disregard for human rights, international humanitarian law, and the international rules-based system that is so apparent. I'd like to highlight the following key points. First, the illicit proliferation, diversion and misuse of arms contributes to sexual and gender-based violence. As the Secretary-General has reported, approximately 70 to 90% of conflict-related sexual violence incidents involve small arms and light weapons, and women are disproportionately impacted. To prevent this, integrating gender in arms control and disarmament is critical, and this should be reflected in our international instruments. For example, we welcome the fact that the Arms Trade Treaty compels states to assess the potential risks of exported or diverted arms being used to commit or facilitate acts of gender-based violence. Similarly, the Global Framework for Through-Life Conventional Ammunition Management encourages states to strengthen gender mainstreaming and the full, equal, meaningful and effective participation of women in conventional ammunition management. We must also continue to integrate gender-responsive approaches to curb the illicit transfer of small arms and light weapons. This will be a priority at the upcoming 4th Review Conference on the Programme of Action to Prevent, Combat and Eradicate the Illicit Trade in Small Arms and Light Weapons in all its aspects. Second, we must address deeply rooted gender inequalities and embrace the distinct experiences of women, men and persons of diverse gender identities. Evidence shows that the inclusion, participation and leadership of women in conflict prevention and peace processes lead to better and more sustainable outcomes. That is why Australia is supporting the Southeast Asian Women Peace Mediators and the Pacific Women Mediators networks to facilitate the participation of women mediators and negotiators in conflict prevention and peace processes in both regions. President, in conclusion, Australia's commitment to eliminating sexual violence in conflict is long-standing and consistent with our strong support for human rights, gender equality and the Women, Peace and Security agenda. We support the Secretary-General's call on all parties to conflict to immediately cease all forms of conflict-related sexual violence, and we urge all Member States to do the same. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Australia for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Ireland.
President, thank you for convening this debate. Ireland aligns itself with the statements of the European Union, the Group of Friends of Women, Peace and Security and the LGBTI Core Group. We reiterate our steadfast support to Special Representative Patten and the work of her office, which is indispensable in shining a light on some of the most heinous crimes of humanity. We also commend our briefers, in particular Ms. Niemat Ahmadi, who courageously shared with us the reality in Sudan, where CRSV is being compounded by deliberate destruction of health and food infrastructure and denial of access to humanitarian aid and protection. Ireland condemns conflict-related sexual violence wherever and by whomever it happens. We call on all parties, whether listed in the Secretary-General's report or not, to immediately cease all forms of CRSV and to comply with international law. President, the report makes clear what we already know. Armed conflict and sexual violence go hand in hand. It is sobering that there was a significant increase in the number of CRSV incidents reported in this current cycle. Shocking levels of CRSV have been reported in Ethiopia, Haiti, DRC and elsewhere. The ongoing war in Gaza is having a devastating impact on women, where over 10,000 women have lost their lives. One of the worst catastrophes in living memory, it must stop now. We are appalled by the sexual violence carried out during the horrendous terror attacks carried out by Hamas in Israel and the sexual violence against Palestinian detainees and Israeli hostages. Perpetrators must be held to account for these horrendous crimes. Israeli restrictions on humanitarian access and attacks in health centres are limiting access to life-saving services, including sexual and reproductive health care. Ireland echoes the report's call for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire, unconditional release of all hostages immediately, and for all ceasefire and political agreements to address conflict-related sexual violence. Although women and girls are overwhelmingly impacted by CRSV, men and boys have been targeted too, notably in Ukraine, where sexual violence has been used as a method of torture during captivity by Russian armed forces. President, the proliferation of small arms and weapons has fuelled and facilitated this abhorrent phenomenon. It is clear that arms control is an important tool in combating CRSV. We therefore need to step up efforts to adopt and implement gender-responsive approaches to disarmament. We call for the full, equal and meaningful participation of women in all peace and security processes, including throughout all disarmament and arms control processes. We reiterate our call on the United Nations to lead by example in this regard. Women, however, cannot participate if it is not safe to do so. We remain seriously concerned about the level of reprisals faced by women human rights defenders and peace builders, including at this Council. We reiterate our call on the UN system, Member States and civil society to work together to better address reprisals. Protection should never be used as an excuse to limit civil society participation. President, each year we are faced with the grim reality that when it comes to CRSV, impunity reigns. We must do more to ensure accountability. The tools at the disposal of this Council are clear. CRSV should be incorporated as a standalone designation for all sanctions regimes, and women protection advisors should be deployed to all missions and adequately supported and resourced. We must also prioritise an inclusive and survivor-centred approach, ensuring access to services, including sexual and reproductive health rights. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Ireland for this statement, and I give the floor to the representative of El Salvador.
Thank you very much, President. El Salvador is grateful for you for convening this important open debate on conflict-related sexual violence through demilitarization and arms control with a gender perspective. My country aligns itself with the statement by the Group of Friends of Women, Peace and Security made by the distinguished delegation of Canada. President, El Salvador condemns categorically conflict-related sexual violence and expresses its deep concern regarding its persistent use as a tactic of war, torture and terrorism, and its impact on civilians, in particular upon women and girls. We urge all parties to conflicts to immediately bring an end to all forms of conflict-related sexual violence by strictly upholding the Security Council resolutions. We call upon these parties to assume commitments with specific deadlines so as to prevent conflict-related sexual violence. As was recognised by this Council, This continues to be a significant threat for peace and security. For that reason, my country believes that the most possible use should be made of the tools that the United Nations have at their disposal for the prevention of and response to conflict-related sexual violence. We seize this opportunity to make a number of recommendations in this regard. First of all, we believe that the Security Council must continue systematically and in a cross-cutting manner to tackle conflict-related sexual violence. Discussions around such serious violations of human rights must result in tangible decisions to prevent and combat them. Secondly, peace operations with mandates to prevent and respond to conflict-related sexual violence must receive sufficient capacities and resources so they can carry out their activities. We support the deployment of gender advisors and women's protection advisors in peace operations and in resident coordinators' offices and humanitarian affairs offices of the United Nations. Likewise, we support that authorizations and renewals of mandates in peace operations and transition programs should include operational provisions which specifically cover reform of the security and justice sectors so as to prevent and respond to conflict-related sexual violence. Thirdly, we support the mandate and work of the Special Representative Secretary-General on conflict-related sexual violence and her work in establishing the annual reports on conflict-related sexual violence. Fourthly, we encourage members of the Security Council to explicitly include conflict-related sexual violence as a criterion in all sanctions regimes in contexts where this could be occurring. In addition, capacity and resources must be provided at an adequate scale to experts groups so that they can carry out their investigations. Fifthly, we invite the Security Council to increase the coherence between the parties listed in the Secretary-General's report and the persons and entities designated in sanctions regimes. We underscore the fact that sanctions have an important potential to limit the actions of perpetrators and signal the fact that to others that such crimes cannot be committed with impunity. Sixthly, impunity for conflict-related sexual violence must be brought to an end, and formal accountability must be ensured. It's necessary to ensure that formal judicial systems are accessible for survivors, as well as access to health systems, services, reparations, and justice. It's also essential with regard to sexual violence that there is the full and significant participation of women in public life, as well as in peace building and reconciliation processes. Seventhly, we recognize the fact that the need to tackle this phenomenon through disarmament and arms control measures exists, particularly in the field of conventional weapons. In this regard, we welcome the upcoming review conference on the Programme of Action on Small Arms and Light Weapons. We hope that this will contain language aimed at action with regard to involving women in all decision-making processes on disarmament and arms control for conventional weapons, as well as the differentiated impact of illicit trade in small arms and light weapons, their parts and components, and ammunition upon women, men, girls, and boys. And the importance of compiling disaggregated data that is broken down by gender and age and other areas so as to ensure that public policy is more focused and more evidence-based. Finally, President, allow me to express the fact that from my country's perspective, the root causes of conflict-related sexual violence must be tackled by combating the persistent gender equality which exists and promoting significant participation and leadership by women in political processes and institutions at all levels. The Security Council has my country's support to continue to work towards preventing and combating conflict-related sexual violence. I thank you, President.
I thank the representative of El Salvador for their statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Andorra.
Merci.
I thank you, President. Andorra aligns itself with the statement made by the European Union. At the outset, I wish to thank Malta for this meeting and for the choice of the theme of this debate this year. I also thank the Secretary-General and his Special Representative, Ms. Pramila Patten, for the report, whose analyses revealed the grim persistence of conflicts-related sexual violence. Thanks to this morning's speakers, the voices of these victims has been amplified. The various reports of the Secretary-General, and particularly his new Agenda for Peace, as indicated in the concept note, underscore the need to provide a new impetus to disarmament agendas so as to support efforts at preventing and responding to conflict-related sexual violence and crimes. We are grateful for the fact that you have emphasised gender equality and established synergies between the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women and the Women, Peace and Security Agenda. I wish to highlight the fact that prevention of conflict-related sexual and gender-based violence linked to conflict through demilitarization, disarmament and arms control, and combating the root causes of sexual and gender-based violence. President, as provided for in the preamble of the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, and as in its General Recommendation 30, regarding the role of women in conflict prevention, there are various actions proposed for member states in conflict and post-conflict situations, and I quote, "They must also rigorously regulate arms trade and regulate the circulation of conventional weapons, which are often illegal, including small arms and light weapons, so as to avoid them being used to commit or facilitate serious actions of gender-based violence." It is in this regard that we reiterate our full commitment to and support for the effective implementation of the provisions of CEDAW, as well as various other disarmament initiatives. In particular, we support the implementation of the United Nations Programme of Action to prevent and combat and eradicate the illicit trade in small arms and light weapons in all its aspects. President, we are alarmed by the continued increase in levels of violence, violent conflicts, proliferation of arms, as revealed in the report of the Secretary-General. We are deeply concerned by and cannot accept the use of sexual violence and gender-based violence as a tactic of war, perpetrated with impunity. In this regard, the United Nations have powerful instruments, as laid out in the report itself. Allow me to highlight three of these. Firstly, the resolutions of this Council 1820, 1888, 1960, 2106 and 2467. All of these resolutions express the need to prevent and resolve impunity for these heinous criminal actions. These resolutions also recognise the key role of the Rome Statute in combating impunity for combat-related sexual violence, and as a mechanism for the prevention of this type of crime. Secondly, as we have mentioned in the past, Andorra places great value upon the framework for the prevention of conflict-related sexual violence fostered by Ms. Pramila Patten's office as a very useful instrument for prevention. This focuses not only on eliminating gender equality and upon responsibility, but it also includes good practices to incorporate gender-sensitive indicators into earlier warning systems for conflict prevention. Thirdly, we believe that the informal experts group on women, peace and security, created pursuant to Resolution 2242 in 2015, is key to support the Council in the robust implementation of its commitments in this area. We highly appreciate the recommendations of the report in such complex situations. and the suggested focus on victim-centred policies, as well as action aimed at prevention. In this regard, we support the design of gender-responsive policies, as well as proposals to foster and achieve the full participation of women in all aspects, and particularly when it comes to disarmament, as well as considering the root causes for effective and inclusive prevention. We echo the calls to cease any consent for impunity. To conclude, I should like to express gratitude for the work of those who are on the ground, identifying such crimes, supporting victims, and contributing to prevention so as to save lives and respect the dignity of persons. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Andorra for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Malaysia.
Mr. President, at the outset, my delegation would like to express our appreciation to Malta for convening this important debate. Malaysia would also like to thank the briefers for their valuable insights and assessment. Mr. President, Malaysia condemns the abhorrent use of sexual violence as a tactic of war, torture, and terrorism in armed conflict. It is disturbing that the 2024 SG report on CRSV records a 50% increase of verified CRSV cases compared to the previous reporting cycle. Efforts to address this grave issue should employ multifaceted and holistic approach. Central to this, our delegation proposes the following. First, to prevent CRSV, Malaysia underlines the importance of demilitarization, disarmament, and arms control. This is important to dismantle the infrastructure of violence. Communities heavily saturated with military forces and arms, including small arms and light weapons, often experience heightened levels of violence, including sexual violence. Second, the Monitoring, Analysis and Reporting Arrangements, or MARA, established by the UN, has contributed significantly to improve information sharing on CRSV. Through standardized reporting formats and thorough data analysis, MARA enables a comprehensive understanding of the prevalence, patterns, and perpetrators of sexual violence in conflict. Better data and analysis would help facilitate evidence-based policymaking and enhance accountability. Third, peacekeeping missions can play an important role in preventing and responding to CRSV. As a contributing country to UN peacekeeping operations, Malaysia has endeavored to increase the number of women deployed in peacekeeping missions. Currently, there are 94 Malaysian female personnel serving among the 865 Malaysian officials in UN peacekeeping missions worldwide. We have observed that female peacekeepers are better able to access women in communities. Also, women who have experienced CRSV feel more comfortable reporting such incidents to female peacekeepers. Mr. President, Malaysia appreciates the coverage of the situation in Palestine in this year's report by the UN Secretary-General. However, we regret that the sexual violence experienced by Palestinians is not sufficiently elaborated. Malaysia views the situation in Gaza seriously and demands our utmost attention. This includes incidences of sexual violence that have been perpetrated on Palestinians. We demand thorough investigation to be undertaken on these incidences without any discrimination. Mr. President, CRSV remains prevalent in many conflict areas around the world. It is a complex issue that requires not only a multifaceted and holistic approach, but also continuous and concerted international collaboration. Malaysia, in this regard, reiterates our commitment and advocacy to this cause. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Malaysia for their statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Nepal.
Mr. President, I would like to firstly express my gratitude for Malta for hosting this important open debate. Mr. President, we are deeply concerned with the increasing and persistent conflict-related sexual violence for individuals, particularly women and girls around the world. Women and girls are disproportionately the targets of CRSV because of the historical and structural inequalities. Nepal reiterates its strong condemnations of the use of sexual violence as a weapon and a tactic of war. Nepal supports the normative framework of the Security Council aimed at ending sexual violence in the conflict. Mr. President, the rising conflicts, militarizations, and arms proliferation, particularly small and light weapons, are the major causes of the soaring CRSV. Armed groups, organized criminals, and terrorist groups have further worsened the situation. Growing global securitizations and militarized responses to all types of crises, including armed conflict and climate change impacts, also trigger CRSV. Addressing the root causes of the conflicts and crimes, especially through an effective peace-building approach, is therefore urgently imperative. In this context, let me highlight a few points. First, we should systematically integrate gender perspective in demilitarization, disarmament, and arms control framework policies and discussions. Second, we should harmonize national strategies for WPS and disarmament and arms control agenda. Third, UN funds and programs, UN country teams, and IFIs can mobilize support to national governments to strengthen their capacity to address challenges and prevent it. Mr. President, Nepal has been a proactive promoter of women, peace, and security agenda. Nepal was the first country in South Asia and the second in Asia to adopt the National Action Plan in 2011 for the implementation of Resolution 1325 and 1820. The second National Action Plan, adopted in 2022, incorporates the concerns of sexual violence survivors, female combatants, and children born of wartime rape. Following the signing of the Comprehensive Peace Accord in 2006, Nepal is pursuing conflict-related sexual violence cases to ensure accountability for perpetrators and access to justice with reparations for survivors. As the largest TPCCs, Nepali peacekeepers continue to prevent and respond to CRSV in their respective peace missions. Nepal strongly calls for full, equal, and meaningful participation of women in all levels of state architecture and the respective decision-making processes. In conclusion, preventing CRSV requires a strong political will and unwavering commitment to prioritize the agenda, common understanding, and sustain international cooperation and support. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Nepal for their statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Sri Lanka.
Thank you, Mr. President, for giving me this floor. Mr. President, this morning we heard of the grim situation of women and girls in conflict zones by our special representative on sexual violence in conflict, Madam Pramila Patten, which presented to us a grim reminder that it is not good enough to deplore this situation by speeches alone when some of us are supplying arms and ammunition to the very perpetrators of this violence in crass disregard for those underprivileged and lesser women who are subject to the horrors of war and conflict. What an indictment of ourselves. Mr. President, we are mindful of the fact that the UN has adopted international commitments to address gender-related violence in conflict, including UN Security Council Resolution 1960, which provides an accountability system for conflict-related sexual violence, stipulated coordinated and timely action of information on such violence, and calls for countries to establish specific time-bound commitments. Meanwhile, Resolution 2122 sets out the need for humanitarian aid to ensure access to sexual and reproductive health services, including for pregnancies resulting from rape. Mr. President, we also have the Women's Program on Women, Peace and Security, supports women's engagement in all aspects of peace building towards more inclusive, egalitarian societies that can end gender discrimination and resolve conflict without violence. We train peacekeepers to detect, address, and stop conflict-related sexual violence. Other initiatives back justice and security institutions that protect women and girls from violence and discrimination, and public service that are fully responsive to women's needs. Regrettably, with all this, The criminals carry on regardless, while we continue to make lofty speeches. Mr. President, neither has the Resolution 1325 has not been very effective in protecting women in war zones, either from sexual violence, evidence from information we are privy to. The disproportionate impact that armed conflict has had on women and girls highlights all the more the importance of the equal participation and full involvement in all efforts for peace and security. The resolution calls for the protection of women's rights, the prevention of gender-based violence, and the inclusion of women in decision-making processes related to conflict. Mr. President, although significant strides have been made in executing WPS agenda in its 23 years, there exists a wide chasm, I say, that needs to be filled with regard to the core commitments of Resolution 1325. Sexual violence against women and girls in conflict zones is perpetrated with impunity, regardless of such conduct being a grave violation of human rights and a widespread issue that has devastating physical, emotional, and psychological consequences. It's often used as a weapon of war to instill fear, exert power, and destroy communities. With all this staring in our face, we continue to carry on in a state of inertia. Mr. President, efforts to address this issue requires a multifaceted approach, including prevention, protection, prosecution of perpetrators, and the support for survivors as one of urgency. International organizations and governments must play a crucial role in implementing policies and initiatives to combat sexual violence in conflict and provide comprehensive support for survivors who otherwise have no redress against these war crimes. As the Secretary General's annual report on women and peace puts it, experiencing a reversal of the generational gains in women's rights while violent conflicts, military expenditure, military coups, displacements, and hunger continues to increase. Mr. President, a revitalized women, peace, and security framework must involve a comprehensive approach aimed at promoting gender equality, protecting the rights of women, and ensuring their meaningful participation in all aspects of peace and security. My delegation believes that any progressive action in this regard must include policy and legal reforms, gender-responsive institutions, women's participation in leadership, gender-sensitive conflict prevention, protection and prevention of violence against women, gender-responsive humanitarian response and recovery, and adequate resources and accountability. Mr. President, a revitalized WPS framework should be based on a holistic and inclusive approach involving the active participation of women's organizations, civil society, and local communities. It should also be aligned with international frameworks such as the United Nations Security Council Resolution 1325 and subsequent resolutions on women, peace, and security to ensure coherence and effectiveness in its implementation and the protection of women and girls in conflict-ridden areas. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Sri Lanka for their statement, and I now give the floor to His Excellency Archbishop Gabriele Caccia, Permanent Observer of the Holy See to the United Nations.
Thank you, Mr. President. In a world increasingly afflicted by the scourge of war, this annual open debate on conflict-related sexual violence provides an occasion to reflect on the deplorable increase in the systematic use of sexual violence in armed conflict by both states and non-state actors alike. As detailed in the most recent report of the Secretary General on conflict-related sexual violence, militarization and illicit arms proliferation exposes civilians to increased levels of violence. My delegation is particularly concerned about the deliberate use of sexual violence as a strategic method of war by terrorist organizations and other non-state armed groups. Furthermore, the adverse effects of sexual violence on girls' educational opportunities and women's livelihoods, as well as financial support for violent extremist organizations and human trafficking, are also matters of great alarm. In combating the scourge of conflict-related sexual violence, the Holy See wishes to reiterate the importance of considering an approach that can effectively address the real needs of women and girls who fall victims of such violence. In this regard, my delegation deplores repeated attempts to erase the differences between women and men. Indeed, such actions distract from and ultimately undermine critical efforts to address the detrimental impact of armed proliferation and trafficking on women and girls. With this in mind, it is important to emphasize that the full, equal, and meaningful participation of women in conflict prevention and resolution increases the chances of achieving sustainable peace. As Pope Francis has said, the world too needs to look to mothers and to women in order to find peace, to emerge from the spiral of violence and hatred, and once more to see things with genuinely human eyes and hearts. It is imperative for all societies to acknowledge and appreciate the invaluable contribution that each woman represents. For this reason, my delegation believes that it's critical to recognize women as agents of change and to increase their participation in peace building, conflict resolution, and disarmament efforts while upholding their equal dignity and unique gifts. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank His Excellency Archbishop Caccia for his statement. There are still a number of speakers remaining on my list for this meeting. I intend, with the concurrence of members of the Council, to suspend the meeting until Friday afternoon. The meeting is suspended.